So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the meeting of the first live Strategic Policing and Crime Board, today, Tuesday, 28th September 2021. My name is Simon Foster. I'm the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, and I'm joined this morning by members of the board, Chief Constable, Deputy Chief Constable, and other police officers and staff, and representatives of the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner. So if we move immediately onto item 1 of the agenda, which is apologies and Police and Crime Commissioner update. There are times, I should point out, allocated throughout the agenda, and I'll be having regard to those in the interest of an effective and efficient meeting, and to ensure that we complete the meeting within the allocated timescale. So we have apologies from board members Kath Hannon, Assistant Police and Crime Commissioners Tom McNeil and Wazim Ali, and Chief Executive Jonathan Jardine. Are there any other apologies that anyone is aware of? No. Thanks very much. I've got a couple of matters in relation to my Police and Crime Commissioner update. Firstly, on the matter of Birmingham Pride. It was an absolute pleasure to attend Birmingham Pride on Saturday, 25th of September, on Saturday, together with colleagues from the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, the Chief Constable, and other West Midlands police officers and staff, and of course along with the thousands of other members of the public who attended in order to take part in the celebrations. It was of course a reminder that in recent times recorded hate crime has increased, and there have been some particularly disgraceful incidents, and of course hate crime will not be tolerated in the West Midlands. Tackling hate crime is a top priority. It's important that we encourage and facilitate reporting, hold perpetrators to account, and ensure that the right support is in place at the right time for victims. Birmingham Pride was a great opportunity to show our solidarity and support for members of our LGBTQ+ community in Birmingham and across the West Midlands, and it's very important that we actively advance and promote justice, equality and diversity, both for and with our LGBTQ+ community, because we're all stronger together. Secondly, on the subject of consultations, we've submitted a response to government in connection with the comprehensive spending review, and I'll be talking about this more in coming weeks, but in essence, serious long-term issues remain over West Midlands Police budget. Not only has there been no levelling up as far as West Midlands Police is concerned, and no progress from the government on our 1,000 missing police officers, but I'm also concerned that with growing inflation, the circumstances relating to our budget will become increasingly difficult over the coming years. I'll continue to robustly make the case for a fair funding settlement for West Midlands Police, so that the people and communities of the West Midlands can benefit from the policing service that they're entitled to. So, moving on to item 2 on the agenda, which is notes of the last meeting, which was of course on the 20th of July. Are there any matters arising from the notes that anybody would like to raise, please? No, so they're agreed. Thanks very much. Moving on to item 3 on the agenda, questions from the members of the public. We have no questions from members of the public this morning. So moving on to item 4, questions from board members, and we have 3 questions for the Chief Constable from members of the board. The first question is from myself on the subject of Declan Jones, and the question that I have in connection with Declan Jones, Chief Constable, is I would be grateful if it would be possible for you to please provide us with an update on the case of Declan Jones, please.
So thank you, Commissioner. Yes, it is nice to be back live rather than virtual in the meetings. So the public will be aware, ex-police constable Declan Jones was subject to high-profile media issues that arose from mid-April 2020, a series of complaints that arose from social media posts depicting some incidents that the officer involved in. They were referred to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, who investigated as an independent matters. They did determine a number of cases proceeded through to the Magistrates Court for charges for Section 39 assault of which the former officer was convicted on the 28th of August of 2 matters and came before me at an accelerated hearing on the 7th of September where he was dismissed without notice. The officer subsequently been sentenced by the court to ex-officer been sentenced to 26 weeks imprisonment. And of course, as with cases of that nature, there are a number of determination factors when officers are dismissed as a result of matters on duty, which do address issues such as pension forfeiture, which are clearly matters that the Police and Crime Commissioner determines that those matters rightly will proceed. There are, of course, other matters that are being dealt with and considered by the Crown Prosecution Service and the IOPC, which are pending. One matter is pending court proceedings. So that is the chronology. As I said when the officer was dismissed, this was a deeply damaging incident to the force. That we are very, very clearly aware that the huge powers invested in police officers and their wise and considered use sits at the heart of the bond between the police and the public in a model where policing is relied upon for consent. And in this particular case, given that the 2 injured parties in this case were both black men, this plays into, I think, a broader issue and concern that exists not just in the West Midlands Police, but more broadly across the country and internationally about the use of force by the police involving ethnic minority communities. And that work is taken very seriously by the force. And so, just to affirm the position that we operate, the force rigorously ensures that we are monitoring regularly the use of body cams in our interactions with the public, to make sure that actually issues are captured and dealt with. We invest and continue to invest and are reviewing as part of work with National Police Chiefs Council the training for officers, because we do recognise police officers deal with difficult, violent and challenging issues. Policing is a messy business, and on occasions force will absolutely need to be used in the work we do, but we must ensure that is professionally done and within the law. And at the same time, our more serious uses of force, matters such as batons, CS spray and use of taser, are subject to reviews by supervisors when they're used to make sure that officers are receiving appropriate debriefing and training and skills to ensure they are the most effective they can be in situations of confrontation, but at the same time making sure if there are issues of concern, they're properly and professionally examined, and that will be the position we take forward. We are very committed as an organisation in being one that uses the minimal force, and indeed, I think it is fair to say in British policing we use very minimal levels of force anyway, but we will always work to try and improve our ability to deal with conflict and reduce them. All of which is sensible, healthy organisational activity we expect us to take, but I would differentiate that work to ensure we build confidence from what clearly were, in this case, completely criminal actions and are not typical of the behaviour that we see from officers.
Thank you very much, Chief Constable. I would just add the case of Declan Jones was deeply concerning, and my thoughts, of course, are with the victims. For an officer entrusted with policing powers to act in the way he did cannot and will not be tolerated, and I'm pleased that West Midlands Police has acted quickly and decisively in this case to protect the public, and I stand shoulder to shoulder with them on that. As soon as the criminal justice process has been concluded, I'll consider what action might be appropriate via the pension forfeiture process. Moving on to the second question, it was to be asked by Assistant Police and Crime Commissioner Wazim Ali, but unfortunately Wazim has had to give his apologies this morning, so I will ask that question on his behalf. So the question is, following the tragic events in Plymouth this summer, can the Chief Constable please reassure the Board what steps have been taken to review the West Midlands firearm licensing arrangements?
So thank you, Commissioner. It's a very topical issue, as we're well aware of the tragic events in Plymouth. Once again highlight, I think, the importance for effective application of legislative requirements around the management of firearms licensing, and in that particular case around shotguns. The legislation that operates around it has been amended a number of years since 1968, and I understand the government will look carefully at the legislation again to see whether or not aspects of it may need to be brought up to a more modern age, and I think that is a wise and considered approach to considering the use of that legislation, although the restrictions are very substantial in the United Kingdom. There are clearly two issues that the case arose. Clearly the work around incel groups that has sadly been very topical in the United States and has now become more high profile of this case, which is a matter that colleagues in the counter-terrorism unit and others groups will look at very carefully. But the specific issue around licensing services. So West Midlands Police delivers its licensing, firearms and shotgun licensing in a collaboration with the Staffordshire Police. We do that because actually, despite the very large population, because we are largely an urban area, the number of applications for firearms and shotgun certificates is quite low, much lower than Staffordshire Police, who have a larger capability, and that's why a number of years we merged those functions in relation to them. The Home Office highlighted three specific areas that should be looked at, particularly the approach around firearms and shotgun certificates have been seized, reviewed and revoked and surrendered. A report on the outcome of reviews of certificates that have been seized, refused and revoked or surrendered, and general assurances that processes in place about returning certificates are following Home Office guidance and legislation. That's been done jointly with Staffordshire Police, and we have submitted a response to the Home Office around that, which we will happily share. We felt there were no major concerns identified at work, although, as always, there were some procedural areas that are being worked through as a joint action plan to make sure they're as tight as they can, and we're happy to share that with you, Commissioner, around the work. It is rightly and will remain a focus in terms of the joint work both forces do, and a revised Section 22 collaboration agreement has already been worked through between Staffordshire and West Midlands, has been updated so that the governance of the structures around firearms licensing between the two forces are properly dealt with. Clearly, we expect there's some potential law reform in this area, but at the moment, as best we are able to assess against the current legislation, we're satisfied the arrangements in place are robust, but will be subject to monitoring under Section 22 agreement.
Thank you very much for the information, Chief Constable. I would just add that the tragic events in Plymouth show just how important it is that we have robust processes in place around access to firearms. It's important that, as well as police forces reviewing their processes, that the Home Office acts at a national level as well. I'm concerned that the amount the Home Office allows forces to charge for licences is lower than the actual cost of the checks that have to take place. Last year, West Midlands Police lost £170,000 compared to what it costs to process licences and make the relevant checks. That's over £70 for every licence, and we processed about 2,400 last year. And it can't be right that police forces should have to effectively subsidise gun ownership. The Home Office should allow police and crime commissioners to charge what it actually costs forces to process the licences. So we move on to the third question, and that's to be asked by Victims Commissioner Nikki Brennan.
Thank you, Commissioner. My question for the Chief is around the Victims Code, and it is, how is West Midlands Police ensuring all victims of crime are properly informed of the Victims Code?
Thank you for the question. It's very important, and I think is an area of common consistent work that we need to ensure we pay attention to. So officers have received training on the Victims Code and what it involves and its obligations around it. When members of the public are dealt with, the rear of the MG11 statement that we fill in offers an explanation to victims and witness what they could expect from the Victims Code. So that's published as part of the work and is used by officers to explain and left with the victims their reference. We are currently looking to improve some areas, particularly the contact card that we leave with victims, to ensure that actually that does enable them to more properly access their rights. Because there is quite a bit in the Victims Code, and we need to make sure that it's accessible, not just, should we say, the principles that are relayed by officers. So we're looking to include a QR code on the documentation so that victims are able to link into the website and read more about what they're entitled to. We also have a number on our website about the code, a number of accessible materials that enables people to read and review it. And also the Citizens Charter the forces put in place does address this. Part of the work that we do on scrutinising closure of logs and our audit, that team also will do some sampling to ensure that actually as part of our review as to whether the log was dealt with properly, there's feedback to the officer if we don't appear to have complied with the code. I think it is one of those areas we must continue to reinforce and work on. As we know, the code changes periodically, so we've got to make sure officers are kept up to speed. We have parts of the organisation, such as the initial investigation team, where I think those things are more consistent, because officers dealing with a high number of crime victims. So we do quite a lot of work around that, and we will also do regular dip sampling around it. But I would always regard this as an area of work in progress.
Thank you, Chief Constable. It is plainly of paramount importance that the needs and rights of victims are at the forefront throughout the entirety of the criminal justice system. And as you say, Chief Constable, it's a matter that we need to keep under constant scrutiny and oversight to ensure that that's the case. So moving on to item 5, if we may, on the agenda, please, which is the Crime and Performance Report. And Deputy Chief Constable Vanessa Jardine is going to present that report. And I would just reiterate for those who are not aware, we have asked those presenting reports please keep their presentations to about 3 minutes. That's on the assumption that board members will have had an opportunity to read the papers in advance. They're available to the public in any event, and it's to maximise the opportunity for discussions and questions arising from the report. So, Deputy, please take it away.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to give an overview, as you said, Commissioner, on the performance and crime this period. And it's well rehearsed that last year was a very unique year for everybody. And what we saw across the West Midlands was some really significant reductions in our acquisitive crime, and by that I mean our sort of burglary, robbery and vehicle crime. But it was against the backdrop of an increase in our crimes recorded and vulnerability categories. And some of that was due to changes in recording practices. We've talked about in this board previously recommendations by the HMIC regarding our crime recording, and we put a significant amount of effort into that last year. And I'm now very pleased to report to you, Commissioner, that a recent inspection by the HMIC has recognised the work that we did last year, and we are now in a very strong position regarding our crime recording, in that we are recording in over 90% of cases the right number of crimes against those that are reported to us. We are seeing record levels of telephony demand, and that is a national issue, but is one that we are seeing here in the West Midlands as well. So our 999 calls and our 101 calls have increased a significant number. And in fact, over the weekend we received 6,000 calls, combined calls of 999 and 101. And what is quite unique in that is that we are now seeing more 999 calls than 101, which is a real shift for us. We normally see non-emergency calls higher than the emergency ones. We do have multifunctional call takers, so our call takers will switch so that they can manage the demand, because obviously we want to prioritise the 9s first for the emergencies. And we're working very hard on what we call our channel shift. So this is, we want to give members of the public a number of different options to contact West Midlands Police, one that suits them the best. And one of the big advantages for us is in our live chat, so that people can log on to the internet and speak to a call taker there. And in fact, in 2018, 92% of our calls were actually on the 101 system, and that has now reduced to 59%. So we are seeing that channel shift, which gives people options, but also means that we can manage demand in a much better way. It is something we need to continue to focus on. We are seeing it, as I say, nationally, so we're going to look at a number of different areas and things that we can do in order to be able to manage that demand, because it's very important when the public needs to get hold of the emergencies that they can do. We are undertaking a significant amount of work to improve our investigations. That includes our uplift, where we are going to prioritise investigations to put additional officers in. We're looking at our digital opportunities, and we're also looking at a piece of continuous improvement work in our investigations, so that we continually look to improve the way that we deal with investigations. Outcomes is extremely important. It's extremely important to members of the public, and we are seeing a vastly improving picture around our outcomes. Our vulnerability crimes, so our domestic abuse and rape, our outcome numbers remain the same, but the percentage is lower because of the increases in the numbers of vulnerability crimes that we are recording. And violence is a significant priority for us. Since restrictions have been lifted, we have seen an increase in violence. We've seen an increase in our nighttime economy demand in Birmingham city centre, which is not insignificant. And we have two main ways of addressing our violence. Our first with Operation Guardian, which is our suppression team, and they are being deployed into Birmingham city centre at the moment. But you'll also be well aware of our violence reduction unit, which is our longer-term approach to tackling violence as well, and a combined effort there to take both a short and a longer term to tackling the issue of violence.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chief Constable. Do we have any questions from the board, please? Charmaine.
Is there a pattern that lets us know why there has been a rise in 999 calls?
Pattern in terms of types
of the reasons why the 999 calls have risen, or is there a specific kind of crime that has become more predominant?
No, we're not aware. In fact, the Chief Constable has instigated a piece of work regionally to have a look at the demand and what is the analysis behind the calls that are coming in. Because at the moment, nationally, we're seeing an increase. We do think, and there is an assumption that the lifting of restrictions has caused people to be calling us more. And as I say, our 101 and the 9s are both increasing significantly, but it is unusual that the 9s are more than our non-emergency. But there's no particular pattern, there's no particular type of offences. We do know that sometimes there is inappropriate use, and we work very hard, and we've done some media around informing members of the public around calling us inappropriately. But there's nothing that we're seeing that we can pinpoint to a specific reason for the increase, apart from the lifting of restrictions, which I think has impacted on people calling us more.
Can I just answer that, just ever so slightly, because Vanessa referred to the conversation we had regionally. So you probably see that we normally expect, for example, ambulance demand to be very busy in the winter. It's extremely busy and has been all summer. You've probably seen the debate in some areas about military drivers in London. Particularly, I know the Metropolitan Police has put drivers into the ambulance service. The reason we're doing the regional work is that a lot of this call demand intervals is not crime. So when you look at there are some increases in recorded crime. They largely relate to crime recording practice around vulnerability crimes. This is not lots and lots of crime that's coming into the system. A high proportion of it's not. As we know, the police deals with acute issues through 999. I think we have to recognise in society there are probably some chronic problems that are becoming acute, where communities have not been in touch about issues. I think our other issue we will look very carefully at here is the emergency services are fully back at work. I don't think it's quite clear yet about many of the other services, either statutory or commission, whether they're fully back at capacity. And inevitably, if a lot of that preventative activity is not in place in other agencies, it will come through the door of acute services like the police service. So particularly looking at things like how much this is mental health related. And our sense is there is a lot of things coming through the door for emergency services now that do not feel typical of where we were pre-pandemic. So we are going to, you're right, I think you're right to ask the question, what is it? We need to do some more analysis of it. We need to particularly pinpoint if there are some trends where we'd expect other preventative services to be working. But it's not that crime has exploded. I think actually, as the Deputy says, a lot of that acquisitive crime is still a lot lower than we've seen in 2019. Some of it's still falling. The amount of domestic abuse cases, some of it is actually more, we're recording more offences per case. Not that we're suddenly having an explosion of crime. And I think that is a problem because the system is becoming imbalanced now to a lot of 999 traffic on issues that we think should be being fixed elsewhere.
When you say vulnerability crimes, is that around mental health or around domestic?
No, I think that domestic abuse, harassment, which are actually crimes, being mentally ill isn't a crime, is it? We know that.
Yeah,
it can present in crime, but it can present in crime. Yeah. But generally speaking, as we say, a lot of what we're getting calls about are not what we would call crime.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and I think and every force in the region is feeling this at the moment. And actually, when I speak to colleagues, everybody else is. And we can see what's going on in the ambulance service, they're feeling it as well. So I think there's a lot of kind of acute pressure in the system at the minute. We just need to analyse that.
Can I just clarify, I know mental health not crime, but I meant people who may have perceived something that was mental health and then perceived that as something else and reported it into the 999.
Yeah, no. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? I think is that I suspect there's more mental health issues coming into us as acute problems because they're chronic issues that are not being resolved elsewhere, and that's tricky for us to do. But we probably come back to this issue at future points because we need to find a way of dealing with what's coming through, but at the same time finding a way of kind of getting it in the right place, because too much of it, I don't think, feels like it's the police's.
Thank you. Lucinda.
Thank you, Commissioner. Question is, item 14, 101 calls took an average 13 minutes, 27 seconds compared to a normal average of 5 minutes. A massive leap is that, 13 minutes, 27 seconds. There'll be members of the public who will be probably saying to themselves or shouting at the screen saying, well, you're talking about the average of 5 minutes compared to previous, but surely 5 minutes is a long time as well. The people there saying that I waited longer than 5 minutes.
So this is in relation to the unprecedented demand levels, because we will always prioritise our 999 calls first. So we will answer the nines. So as I said, our call handlers will take both. They will take nines and the 101 call, but they will always answer the 999 first. So it is not where we want to be in taking 13 minutes to answer a 101 call. You know, I'd like to make that very clear. However, we prioritise the nines, and it's the demand that's coming in. So, you know, I know I said that we received over 6,000 calls at the weekend. That doesn't really mean anything unless I put it into context for you. So, in context, probably an average day we would see about 1,900 nines and 101s, and we're looking at sort of that going up to 3,000. So, not far off doubling the numbers of, and at the moment, you know, that is what is causing the increase in the length of time it's taking us to answer the 101.
At this point as well around the length of time for 101. So first of all, they're non-emergency calls. So by that definition, they're not waiting for a fast response from the police. But also, because of the vulnerability issues, the increases in vulnerability calls, as well as COVID, we're having to spend a lot more time on the phone. So there are less call handlers then to answer the calls quickly. So one of the consequences of that, and it's a debate that we have when we're considering our response, you know, getting our service right first time. Actually, there is always a constant balance in that tension between how long we can stay on the call. The complexities of the call have definitely increased. This, again, a national issue. And that we're seeing nationally is extending the length of calls that we're having our call takers on the call for. I think it's interesting what we've seen through the pandemic about the willingness of the public to wait on the call. So they don't abandon until around 9 minutes. Sometimes, so we know that average data, again, these are all averages. But equally, they're not wanting to be deflected, because that's what we call it, onto online services, which we do have available. So again, we've seen some changes in behaviour, and we're therefore doing a lot of work to push the public and to give the public confidence to use some of our other contact channels, again with the hope that then we can reduce that call handling time. Complex picture, but I would say as well we are spending longer on the call.
Moving on to my next question, if I may, Commissioner.
Yes,
it's related, but yeah, I agree with what you're saying. However, we've got to take into account that there's many members of the public out there who will prefer to pick up a phone and contact the police that way.
Yes.
Have we got, I mean, call handlers, are they restricted to you're on the phone for 5 minutes, 8 minutes, or is it as long as it takes?
No, there's no, we know what the average length of time that we spend on it, but they are not restricted. So if they get a particularly complex matter to deal with, then the call does not cut off, you know, but they try and deal with it as expeditiously as they possibly can, but there is no cut off or length of time that they have to take the call for.
Well, what would you say the average length of time is for a 101 call?
9 minutes.
It is 9 minutes.
The average length of time that we're on the call for is 9 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
I think it's probably just worth adding on the end of paragraph 15, and this is a really important point. 75% of what comes into the contact centre is dealt with there. You don't have to send it out then for physical attendance for officers. So the productivity in the contact centre is extremely high. Bear in mind during this time as well, the contact centre staff were affected by the pandemic and the pandemic, so our abstraction levels were there. And, you know, so, I mean, we'll clearly have a look at what we do around this. What, you know, we kind of wondered whether the world would settle down a little bit for summer. It isn't settling down very quickly. You know, I think there's going to be a resource issue in here. Because, you know, we probably compare incredibly well against most, well, we compare incredibly well against policing on productivity for call handler. So actually, it's going to come down to a resource debate, I think, ultimately.
Just follow up on that. We understand that with policing is a difficult job. It's not an easy position. However, call handlers, they're also under a lot of pressure as well. What can be a routine call can change dramatically, you know, to emergency call. What provisions have we got for call handlers? Is there anything that we've got for call handlers?
Anything
In regards to their well-being?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. So call handlers have exactly the same opportunities as all members of staff within West Midlands Police with our occupational health department. Obviously the supervisors have regular conversations with people. There's also, if they deal with a particularly traumatic incident, there's a debrief afterwards. So there are a number of different things that are in place, because you're absolutely right. It can be very traumatic, you know, receiving some of the calls that they receive, but there is a strong and thorough welfare provision for all our staff in the contact centres.
Thanks, Linda. Charmaine?
You mentioned around the nighttime economy, and I think somewhere around the question is how is that being dealt with? I remember some time ago there used to be like the nighttime economy forum. So are you working with partners? Are there initiatives like the street pastors that are still out there? Can you just like open it out a little bit more for?
So it's very much a sort of partnership approach to policing the nighttime economy, for caring and dealing with, you know, that issue. So for one example would be working very closely with the licensing department in Birmingham City Council. Now what we've seen actually when we've come back into the restrictions being lifted is that many of the establishments have struggled with door staff, and they've struggled on a number of different fronts. So firstly, we sort of, the experience of dealing with people in the nighttime economy, so the security staff in there, and for police officers as well, so some new police officers who've not policed nighttime economies before, but also recruiting into some of the positions has been difficult. So we've worked very, very closely with Birmingham City Council on licensing, for example, but also with the provision of welfare out in the nighttime economy as well. And so it is very much a partnership approach that we are dealing with here when trying to get people to come out to safely enjoy the nighttime economy, you know, and to go home safely at the end of it. But we are seeing that actually violence has increased with the numbers of people that have come out into the streets, and that is something that we are trying to deal with.
Are the universities involved? You know, it's the new year, we've got newbies in our city and all the rest of it. How do you work with the universities to protect some of our newbies that may not know our city too well?
Yeah, so we have specific officers from the neighbourhood teams that liaise with the university, with Freshers Week, and with all the new influx of young people that are coming into the city. Work very closely in speaking to them, educating them, and that's, you know, a big responsibility on the part of the university, but we also support them and offer help and advice in relation to that as well.
Final question. I know you said that you're working with the licensing and all the rest of it, but do you have any communication with some of our promoters as well, who would be actually going for these licenses to hold events in some of our venues, and what are those relationships like?
Yeah, we have very good relationships with the major establishments, you know, in the nighttime economy. Lots and lots of conversations, because they want to run a successful establishment, and we want them to do that, so we support them and we help them, you know, and offer them advice and support, and work very closely with them. And it's all wrapped up in conditions of the licence that they hold, and that they work with us, and we help and influence some of the conditions that are put onto the licences as well.
Thank you, Deputy. I have a question just returning to the subject of call demand. I'm going to notice that to manage the challenges that were faced around call demand in recent months, priority decisions were taken to deploy additional resources into force contact. and I understand the report says that that resulted in some improved performance against call answering across 101 and 999. So my question, I guess, is in three parts. Firstly, was that additional resource sourced from other areas? Secondly, how long will that additional resource be in place? And thirdly, what was the improved performance that we saw as a consequence of that additional resource being allocated?
So the additional resource did come from other areas, but what we tried to do is take people who were non-operational for various different reasons, which might be health reasons, or so trying not to take directly from the front line and put people into our contact centres in that area. And the performance, that we saw was an improvement in the time to answer the calls, and you can see there, when we talk about, well, the time has gone up, that that it was greater than that, and we managed to reduce the average length of time that we take to answer the calls. And the plan at the moment, there is no plan to take those staff back out, while we are seeing this increases. The Chief Constable mentioned that we are going to review the resources, so at this moment in time we are not going to remove those officers, because normally, as you know, Commissioner, we plan for a series of summer demand. Demand goes up in the summer, and then sort of starts to flatten off a little bit before darker nights come in, and we'll see another. We haven't seen that pattern this year. So at this moment in time, there is no plan to remove the resource, because the demand is still there that we need to meet.
I mean, I think of a flavour about some of the other capabilities the forces have. So at the height of the pandemic, the forces data science team used Public Health England's algorithm on infection rates to predict what the impact would be on contact, which it got within about 1% accuracy. So we were able to do a longer term prediction model like the impact through the pandemic, which led us, yes, I think as Vanessa said, we allocated some restricted duties to people, but also we actually hired some short-term contractors and had some people come into the organisation. They were easier often to deploy around things like our public inquiry counters, because the challenge we have, we need to be very careful we don't simplify, and I think the point you were making about the contact handlers jobs, these are really sophisticated jobs. The technology they use is very advanced now. The assessments they have to make on calls is much more complicated than a number of years ago. They're highly specialist areas of work, and a recording we have to train. We've always got, it's the one area of the force where we recruit above what we would say is the standard hub, because we don't want any vacancies in that department. So if somebody leaves us, we already want to have people in training ready to replace. So we've been quite imaginative on this area, but I think as Vanessa says, it's becoming now a bigger picture that says actually that demand is not going down now, which is not reverting. So we need to look at problem-solving levers to say, why are these calls coming to us? Because they don't feel like ours. So what's going on out there? But we probably are going to have to debate about the numbers of people in that area. And obviously our intention, because these are police staff roles, they shouldn't particularly affect the police officer establishment, but they have a financial impact. We're going to have to assess the budget against as we go into next year.
Thank you. Yes, Bhupinder.
Thank you, Commissioner. Item 32, increasing community volunteers. I can see here that we've got currently 534 young people in the cadet scheme, an increase of 76. Can we have a breakdown of that? Gender, ethnicity? Are we getting a really good response from one community and not getting the response that we're looking for from another community? And if that is the case, then what are we doing to address that?
So we don't have any issue recruiting cadets. There are many young people who want to join the cadets. Our issue has been in getting the right number of leaders in the right areas for the cadets, as opposed to, we have wonderful engagement from our schools, which is where most of our cadet units are based. We did a very deliberate recruitment process for our cadets when we started out, in that we wanted to go to our most deprived areas. We deliberately wanted to be in those areas for our cadet units, and that's where we are focused. So we can absolutely get you the breakdown in both gender and ethnicity. I can provide that for you, Bhupinder. But we don't have any issue recruiting cadets. We focus very specifically on those areas where we think the most value to the young people will be.
Thanks, Bhupinder. Can I just ask a question around the 75% appropriate resolution rate? That's the ability to be able to resolve matters coming in by way of call demand immediately, rather than requiring further work. I mean, is that 75% a consistent level over a period of time? Has that altered? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? And do we find there's any disparity in the ability to be able to resolve cases on the telephone or online, for example? Is there any disparity between the effectiveness of being able to resolve cases, or does it not make any difference?
I'm not aware that it makes any difference, if I'm brutally honest.
No.
I think, you know, we are very keen that when members of the public call us, that we are able to resolve their issue, whatever that might be. And as the Chief Constable said, you know, we try and do that, and we do that very successfully, because we want to deploy our officers to members of the public where they can be the most effective. And if we can either resolve somebody's issue as soon as they ring us, or we can signpost them to the right organisation or the right response that they need, then, you know, that we see that as a success. There are no, you know, call handlers are not trying to just not send officers. We will send officers appropriately, but actually, you know, most people, as you can see, you know, 3/4, we can actually resolve their issue or get them to the right organisation in the first time, which I think is a success, you know, for us to be able to do that, as opposed to just sending an officer, you know, who can probably give the same advice. So our highly skilled call handlers are able to do that, which I think is positive for members of the public.
Sure, thank you. I think it's generally acknowledged that it can be the case that call demand can sometimes be generated by a disproportionate number of calls coming from repeat callers. Is there any dedicated or specific work that the force does in order to attempt to address that issue?
So our neighbourhood teams are our problem-solving teams, and you're quite right, Commissioner, you know, repeat callers often display extreme vulnerability, and it's not as easy in a call, therefore, to be able to resolve that. So our neighbourhood teams run different levels of problem solving, from the very top end, where they will run what we call FARAs, which are formal problem solving matters, right down to just engaging, you know, with an individual who, as I say, very often has a number of complexities. So yes, they will invariably sit with the neighbourhood teams to go and engage with that person, because we very often need to get support of other agencies to help us, whether it be worklessness, be it mental health issues, so that we can address it and, you know, and stop that person generating that demand, which then leads to the, you know, 10 minutes plus that it takes to answer a call when we've got somebody who's repeatedly phoning us for reasons that are not police matters.
Absolutely. I mean, is there any method by which we measure success in terms of those community policing interventions with a view to addressing those disproportionately high repeat callers? Do we see any success stories as a consequence of those interventions?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, in our key performance indicators this year, there are measures around repeat demand and reducing repeat demand. So we have them around domestic abuse, we have them around missing people, and absolutely, you know, there's a real focus on looking at our repeat demand and reducing it. So one of the things, I know it's not against callers, but is around our top 10 on neighbourhood repeat demand locations, which can be anything from schools, that could be an individual, you know, and what interventions are being put in place, and looking at then the calls that reduce and the numbers of crimes that reduce in those areas. So yes, it's very much a focus for us.
Thank you. Anybody else for Pinder?
Just I have a question from me. Thank you. I just want to go back to item 31. Education. Yes, we have violence, we have domestic violence. It's acceptable. But we need to work with communities. We need to understand some people. I mean, for me, the key word there is education. How are you working with communities? How are you educating people? Because for some people, sadly, derogatory behaviour, you know, the norm. It's, you know, it's It's part of society, it's part of culture. How do you educate? How do you work with their communities to educate them?
So, talking specifically around violence, as I said, the Violence Reduction Unit is our longer term approach, working with a number of different partners to get out into the communities. That's not to say that our neighbourhood teams don't also do that, who are continually engaging and work a lot of the time. One of the principal areas is the cadet scheme, because the cadet scheme is absolutely brilliant. Get young people in, we work with them, and they do go through a program, and a lot of that program is around education, is around and it's great that because they're part of the police family as part of the cadets. But the Violence Reduction Unit works, is working on a sort of 12-month, 3-year, 5-year program, working in schools, going into schools, as do the neighbourhood teams, and engaging with young people, because I completely agree with Linda. It is getting to the young people and talking to them and getting them to understand what their behaviour means and what they're learning, that it's going to change this longer-term situation. Broad Street on a Saturday night is not the time to be trying to educate people. It is, and I think cadets is a brilliant way of doing that, which is why we target our, where we want our cadet units in those areas, because it has the most impact.
I mean, I spent half a day last week with the VRU looking through the stuff they're doing. I think this, I think it's very difficult for the public to probably understand what the violence reduction unit is, because they often look at the police when it's crime, so they expect the police to lead. I describe the violence reduction unit. Police are doing fellowship. We're following some of the strategies around the VRU, and this is particularly the case in education. I think it's very important the police are very good at being the police and not trying to do other people's jobs. And actually, educators are better at educating than the police are. And I think what's very impressive, and I'm sure at some stage the Commissioner will turn attention in the board to the VRU. So I sat through some of the work we're doing. So the VRU run the Mental Violence Programme within schools, and a number of schools have taken that up. It's a very responsible approach to addressing issues around violence. Most schools have taken it, seen performance improvements in their schools around their own behaviours of their pupils. I was looking at the commission service we do that's curriculum based around healthy relationships and violence in primary schools that we're doing, again through the VRU. And the strength of VRU is it's got people in there who are teachers, who know how to write curriculum, are able to pull together local authorities in a way that we would never be able to do. Because if we go along and say we'd like to, largely tell people not to be violent, we're not going to be terribly good at that. The types of programs being developed for VRU are very, very impressive, I would say. And it was quite inspiring, some of the people who've got work in that area. So there is a lot going on that paragraph can't cover, but I think in due course, either at a broader group session or as a board, it's definitely worth doing some in-depth work around the VRU. There's some amazing programs running in the region.
Commissioner, I just wanted to ask you, right, Commissioner, I'm actually reading more into this than is written here. Can we have some feedback? How the cadets are going, how the program's going, are we getting any barriers? Are we approaching any barriers? How are we dealing with them barriers?
So I mean, we've previously done papers on cadets, we can do that. I mean, cadets is very successful, it's growing. I think, as Vanessa said earlier, they're probably our most diverse part of the force, in representation terms. I don't think there are many barriers we're seeing at all around it, actually. But we can definitely do a reform cadets in due course.
Two quick questions. You mentioned that you do a lot of work with schools through the VRU. What about youth clubs and those that are slightly older than the school age and outside of formal education? How do you engage with those and encourage them to be a part of the cadets, etc.?
Yeah. So particularly on the areas around violence reduction, which is where we want to be with schools. The principal approach is the VRU, and the VRU is not part of the force. We're one of the partners in there. The local authorities are partners. We have seconded police officers in that team. The VRU director and staff are employed with the PCC's office, but they are far better at designing curriculum inputs and programs. Stuff the force does is we keep good links with schools through the neighbourhood teams, and that's one of the areas we intend to strengthen, because it's important there is a police visibility in the schools. It's important police as a service are engaged with schools. We're not always the best people to do education though, if I'm really honest. There was nothing in my police career made me particularly well educated to stand in front of a class. So, you know, we need to be clear about that. And of course, the other thing is the Cadet Program. We can talk about that, but as Vanessa said, it's based around the schools, and we based it in particular areas where we know that the community and the schools face challenges. So, you know, it'd be very easy to recruit cadets anywhere, but we've gone for those areas. So there is a lot of things that I don't think we'd be able to address in detail today, but I would make the point, the VRU isn't part of the force. The VRU, we are but one partner in, and its approach to prevention is something we're docking into and following, but I would say they are better at it than the force is, and actually they build more legitimacy than the force can do sometimes. The VRU is finding safe ways for the public to have conversation with the police about these issues where there is often lower trust.
My question was more about those who are outside of formal education.
So we've got links into PRUs and referral units and people outside, and that's the whole strategy the VRU's work is about, because we know, don't we, you're absolutely right, a lot of the young people involved in violence have dropped out of mainstream schooling. So that's type of intervention. So I think Claire, the director, could do quite a good overview, particularly those locations. And for the link officers, we see often the pupil referral units are areas where we're trying to put link police officers as well. So you're dead right, they're the places we should be, and you'd be reassured of what the work we are doing in that area.
Final question was around point 34, where it talks about reducing repeat missing children. It talks about that there is a rate of 2% of repeated, reported of children being missing. And my question is, in your opinions, or if the research shows, why is there the repeat reporting? Is it because those who are reporting ain't feeling that they've been heard, or that nothing's been done quick enough? Why?
Why has the number gone up slightly?
Yeah, and is it because people who are reporting their children missing are not feeling that they've been heard or anything's been done? Is that one of the reasons?
No, I've not had any feedback that is, you know, one of the reasons. I think the lifting of restrictions has increased the number. A large number of our children that go missing are our looked after children, and we engage very, very closely with children's homes, and there are very, well thought through, well understood policies and practices as to when homes report children missing. It's an absolute priority for us, and this is another one of those areas that is a specific, something that I specifically look at in the performance panel that I chair, because, you know, children going missing is extremely important to us. Whilst the numbers have gone up slightly, again, it's an area of huge problem solving for our neighbourhood policing teams, looking at children's homes and the numbers of children that go missing from them, because it's an absolute priority. But it's very often, again, a multi-agency approach that we need to do to tackle children's issues, which is multifaceted, and you know, a number of different partners get involved with that. So I absolutely haven't heard, I mean, Claire's, you know, responsible for public protection of anything that would indicate that we are not taking it seriously, we take it as an absolute priority.
I think it would be just worth saying that figure is an average again. So what we've got in there, you'll have some children who've been missing multiple times, 30, 40 times, and there could be some children. So this isn't, so it's quite a difficult statistic to kind of think of what that manifests itself like in real life. Does that make sense? So it wrapped up in there is, as I say, a smallish number of children who go missing repeatedly, and that's where the problem-solving approaches are taking place, where there'll be multi-agency strategy discussions to look at what it is that we can do to help the child feel that they can be in the place where they're living at that moment in time. There will be some out-of-town placements as well, so we will have some children who will place within Birmingham or Coventry or wherever, the same way that we will place some of our children away if they are at risk from situations. So it is complex, and within that figure is that complexity. I think what we just saw was that average number went up when COVID restrictions were lifted, because I guess their freedom given to them a little bit more, and that might be where we have had some who perhaps wouldn't have been in that pandemic, and that's just inflated the figures slightly.
Maybe a little bit more of a breakdown on in this document, because it actually
Yes,
doesn't talk
understand.
about that
No.
people really looked after care or if they're
Yeah.
with their parents, that's why it was a bit,
Yeah.
so you've just opened it up a bit more.
It is a really there is an awful lot within that statistic.
Thank you. I think in view of time, we'll conclude matters on this particular agenda item. Thank you so much, Deputy, for presenting the report and taking questions, much appreciated. So, if we move on then to item 6 on the agenda, which is the Estates Strategy Review, and we have Andy Kelly here to present the report. And when you present your report, perhaps you could just explain exactly what your position is within West Midlands Police, Andy, and I just repeat what I said on the earlier agenda item in terms of attempting to limit the time for presentation to about 3 minutes. That's okay.
Commissioner, I'm going to cover this one off actually to start with. Andy's going to help me answer all the questions you've got, so sorry, the agenda's there. So the reason for that is obviously this was one of the areas you asked me to take away and look at the force, and Andy and team have done a very good job on this. So the approach on the paper talks about the principles that we're applying to the estate. I'm very conscious when the estate paper comes, a number of people begin to look about what it means for their local police station. And so it's probably appropriate, I always recognise the estate is a very emotive issue. I think I'll start off by saying the estate of a police force like West Midlands Police is extremely complex in the types of buildings we've got. You know, that people will look at the local police station as the forefront of it, but of course we've got counter-terrorism units, surveillance operations we have to deliver, we have large-scale major events, we have a very high throughput prisons, we have an amazing amount of property and exhibits to handle, and we have an enormous fleet. So the type of estate that the force has is very important. So the strategy we've taken over a number of years is to clearly ensure that we properly address the estate with strategic buildings that we need. So people have seen the new C3 building out at Aston, which is the big command and control facility that we've built that will help us police the Commonwealth Games, but also helps us respond to extreme threats, major incidents, potential terrorism attacks, etc. We need something like that. So we need to deliver those complex buildings. We need to deliver local buildings when local is really important. Neighbourhood teams being based in local areas is very important. Doesn't always mean it has to be in one of our buildings. In some ways, more effective for us to be with partners. And of course, we also want the building to be efficient. So particularly the work on our sites is to make sure that every square metre of estate we've got costs us money and costs the taxpayer money. We want to use it really well. To make sure we're not wasting money on buildings we don't need lots of space for. And of course, we want them to be efficient, both in terms of the cost of running the buildings, but also because of our impacts on the climate. That's quite important. We also have an efficient estate as well. So what the paper covers off today does not cover off police station by police station. As you rightly asked us to do, we have looked at how to approach going forward on the estate in an appropriate way that delivers a modern service and a greener estate. We've had to adjust slightly our timescales that we'd already got on our estate plan because of COVID, and we have changes because of the uplift programme that now mean more space is required for a number of issues around policing. You will not believe how much storage individual officers need for kit and equipment, and actually that's one of the major factors we have to take into account around the building. So the paper, to kind of conclude, sets out a series of principles the force recommends that we follow to guide us through the next phase. I think many of these will reassure the public that local is still incredibly important, although it can be delivered in different ways. It ensures the force is properly placed to ensure it's effective going forward. And what our intention will be to Commissioner is to return to you then as what that directly means to the individual stations. And what I would say this is, a lot of, and a great deal of what was already in the estate strategy we believe is correct. Many of the buildings that we have made decisions around will still, whatever we change on the principles, will still remain in a position where the condition is poor and they need to leave the estate, or they're no longer the right accommodation. But clearly we recognise this is an area we want to clarify for individual people so that they're very clear what the local structure looks like. So not a lot of detail on individual buildings today, more the principles.
Thank you very much, Chief Constable, for that summary in relation to the Estates Review strategy.
Thank you, Commissioner. We've got here, item 6, current estate is comprised of 60 properties. Then we go back on to number 7, a significant proportion of the estate still remains in poor condition. If we take out the poor condition, which, because obviously we've got to take into consideration nowadays about more green and more efficient, if we start taking these properties out of the equation, are we not taking away local stations, local buildings that local residents can feel attacked to that, yes, we've got a local NPT here? Can you answer that?
So, and I'll jump in here. So one of the principles we've set in the paper is where we need to have local teams. So the team that is important that's locally based is the neighbourhood team. They're the people who work with partners on the ground, they work closely with the community, they want to problem solve. Of course, that makes huge sense, they're based locally. But, you know, is it better that team's based in the building with the fire team who work there, or in Walsall based with the local authority in that area where they can deliver the effect? Because they need a building to work from, to be based from, to keep their equipment, meet members of the public. But those buildings are not providing the front inquiry offices, they're not providing public access. The principles say it's really important that they're based locally. The estate, none of it's free, even if it's old, it costs us, as we know, a huge amount of money. And some of the buildings are in poor repair. So they've reached the end of their lives, but actually, as we've done, and Andy can talk about a number of cases, we've found a building to share to keep the team locally. They're working in better conditions, they're working alongside partner agencies, and that's better than, I think, keeping an older, decrepit building that's cost the taxpayers huge amounts of money and actually isn't a great working environment. Do you want to give some examples, Andy?
Yes, thank you, Council. So I introduce myself, Commissioner. So Andy Kelly, Assistant Director, Head of Corporate Asset Management and Police. So a number of departments in there, but including property services and estate management. And on behalf of the Chief Constable and the Director of Commercial Services, Neil Chamberlain, I'm running the Estate Strategy Program. Policing has evolved over time, and the buildings that were in geographical locations from a while ago are not necessarily in the right condition going forward. The force has shrunk, as we know, but also we've centralised some departments. So we've moved away from the old neighbourhood building providing everything in that location to it providing neighbourhood team requirements. Now, we have not invested in those buildings for 6, 7, 8 years because of austerity measures. Do we now invest in that whole building, which is far too big for our requirements, or do we look for a more cost-effective solution? And we've done some great work with West Midlands Fire Rescue Service, co-locating with them. It's seen some real benefits in terms of school engagements, where actually we're going as police and as fire, where we're understanding the local issues better by having that co-location planned. There's also some good work done with councils and more to be done in the future, I hope. But our co-location with Walsall that we did 5 years ago has proved invaluable.
Just following on from the Cabinet Commission.
Yes, of course, but
I'm sure you agree with me that it's not about working hard, it's working smarter. We've got to go forward nowadays. I totally agree with you that is it sensible to spend thousands of pounds on a building that we know 10 years down the line we're going to have to reinvest in that building again. So it makes sense to share buildings. For me, it makes sense that we do share buildings with other organisations. But can we go look forward from that? Okay, you know, we talk about sharing with the fire department, the departments. What about youth centres, community buildings? Because for me, the heart of the neighbourhood is NPT. We've got a good NPT. It works with the community. It feeds information back. You know, what's your thinking on going forward? Okay, we do look at working, moving in with fire services and other organisations. But what about community-led organisations?
So we work closely, obviously, with the combined authority and one public estate, but we're all in that forum together. You know, we've got this bit of the state, you've got that bit of the state. And there was some really progressive work to be done there. I wouldn't say we've got the community leaders around the table in that discussion. And I will defer to the Chief Constable and Operational Policing as to how we might be a good marriage for having police services and the local youth centre in the same building. There
Yeah.
are some operational
There are.
sensitivities that we have.
Yeah, so one of the things we've got to look at on the buildings, if you can imagine, so we look for buildings that make economic sense in the right place. And fire's been a good partner. Fire's a good partner because their operating model requires them to station their vehicles in a particular way, which means their footprint. And actually, a lot of the fire stations, if you ever look, are very close to the police stations for some reason. So they've been really easy. We've done local authorities. We often look at areas. It's not beyond the bounds of ability. We look at areas like schools either. The challenge we've got a little bit is there are some security issues around aspects of what we have to store in the buildings, which would also be a factor. So we have our technology in there, our access to that, CS gas officer carriers, sometimes tasers. So some of the buildings would have to fit with the criteria. But our general view is we're very pragmatic about where we base. The neighbourhood principle is about basing locally. The work we do with the combined authorities is to look at all the estate options that exist. So there's no reason why we do that, and there's no reason why, there's no ideological reason why, but when we come to look at shared building, there's an economic, there's a security, and there's other assessments we have to do.
I totally agree with it, but going forward, I would like further reports. I'd like to look at this more deeper, because I seriously think that we can work alongside local communities, organisations, group centres. Absolutely agree with you in regards to storing equipment, you know, sensitive information, but it can be done. It can be done.
So I think we look for the right location for a neighbourhood team, and then we'll fill those criteria. I think we are agnostic about who's the right public partner, as long as it can deliver the right services to policing, and that's the approach we take. This is not, you know, fire is an obvious partner for us for obvious reasons, but we're quite agnostic as to our approach to public partner relocation.
Yeah. I agree with that. I just want to say, sorry, Commissioner, there,
No, it's okay.
many years ago, I just want to give you an example in Leeds, I can't go into full detail, but we had an NPT at a local garage. It worked so well. It worked excellent. It was there for many years. And it's just an example that sometimes you've got to look, you know, further afield.
Thank you, Charmaine.
With all of this, looking at buildings and venues, whatever it is, how have you consulted the public? How has their voices and their wants and needs been considered in some of the decisions that you've been making?
Okay, so these are invariably more local issues, aren't they? So, you know, if we looked at parts of the estate, such as the fleet, where we put our garages, they're not massive public interest issues in the same way. When we've done some of the larger strategic buildings, so for example, the custody block builds, as you can imagine, when they are locating where we have, you know, we think very sensitively about them, we engage with local authorities, we have done local consultations when we built those sites, because they can generate public concern, can't they? The only where the engagement happens most widely is largely on the very buildings we talked about, the neighbourhood policing unit buildings. So, you know, my police station in my neighbourhood is going to disappear, and what's going to be the replacement? And what we're suggesting through the paper is we stage that carefully, because there is a danger, you know, if we just publish a list of buildings, people look at what they're losing and not what they're gaining. And what we try and do when we re-provision a site is be very clear what the replacement's going to be. So, for example, you know, when we've just talked about some of the neighbourhood stations we've closed that are in poor repair, we've always informed, engaged, discussed with the public, locally, IAGs and others, about what the re-provision is going to be when we're in the stage of doing that. What we're trying to avoid is a position where we kind of create lots of uncertainty over a building and don't point to what's going to replace or what the substitution issue is going to be if there's going to come on there. So we do that on case by cases. Custody blocks we did a lot around at the time. Neighbourhood stations is where we focus. We don't tend to focus a lot on public voice on some of the strategic sites, the C3 build, the fleet builds, because largely the public are a bit agnostic about those things.
Thank you. I've just got a question around provision for ensuring that the estate, certainly in terms of the development of custody blocks, has dedicated space for children and young people.
Yeah.
And the extent to which that exists at the moment at Albury and Perry Bar, and also how that is being factored into the consideration for planning and design at the new Eastern Custody Block.
Yeah, I can start off and jump in. So the custody blocks design, so custody is a great example where breaking this over local models was quite important. So the force had nearly 20 custody blocks at one stage that were in a bit of a state of repair. I mean, we're all going to be excited next year when Steelhouse Lane opens as a museum. When it was built in the 1890s, it was an operational custody block until 2016. Let me tell you, the standards of safe handling of detention of prisoners did not exist in Victorian eras. So what the larger custody blocks have enabled us to do is design them around the safe handling of prisoner standards. They're enabling us to put a lot of diversionary services in the site and also provide extremely effective medical provision. The death in police custody have dropped dramatically nationally. They've dropped very significantly in the West Midlands, and a lot of that is because we're providing safe facilities. So specifically in the issues you talk around juveniles, there is a separate booking in area within those buildings where people will go to that can be dealt with privately, so they're not mixing with adults. Particularly large custody blocks like the ones at Albury and Perrybar that can hold up to 60 prisoners. Some of the holding areas are not the place we want juveniles to be. That wouldn't have been something that was possible on some of the smaller blocks. It's part of the reason why we'd like, particularly we're very interested in the long-term future of a strategic site around Coventry, and we'll probably debate, really making sure all of our detainees are in these modern blocks. So it gives us better facilities, it's more effective, people are safer when they're there, we can divert them more, and you're absolutely right, we do not want juveniles, as they first come into contact with us, sat in a cell full of, some of the worst sites that policing have to deal with. We'd rather screen them from that, and we can do that in the new sites.
Thank you. Is there anything you wanted to add, Andy?
There's an awful lot to add to that, except I think the paper points out that we are looking at the new Eastern Custody site, and planning permission is in, and it's going very well.
Okay, thanks very much for that. One question I've got for you, Andy, which perhaps you might be best able to answer is, it might be helpful if you were able to provide a dedicated summary around some of the specific attention that's now being focused on making sure that we have a greener estate. And I know you cover some of those issues in your report in any event. Just might be helpful for the purpose of this meeting if you summarise some of the work the force is doing around those issues.
Great, thank you. Yes, I think as the Chief Constable pointed out earlier on, in terms of spending the money once and making efficiency savings on spending money, making efficiency savings on green agenda. The two are inextricably linked. If you're not spending money on energy because you're being more efficient, then you've got revenue to reinvest in programs. So I think for a number of years, part of West Midlands Police have been analysing CO2 emissions, have been reporting on CO2 emissions, have been doing what they believe to be best practice, and especially in the State Department and the Fleet Department, they've been doing their bit. Until recently, though, we haven't really brought that all together into one picture and story for West Midlands Police. We are doing that now. We are reporting on KPIs, on CO2 emissions per square metre of the estate, and average CO2 emissions, tailpipe, actual emissions on the fleet, on the average distance travelled. But we still have got more work to do on this. We've recently appointed an environmental and sustainability manager in West Midlands Police. She's been on board now 3.5 weeks, and we know we've got time dedicated to yourself to understand exactly where we want to, what our aspirations are going forward. We have an environmental policy, but we need to turn that into a real environmental strategy. And an awful lot of what we do, we can put in, the most efficient boiler, we can buy the most efficient vehicles, but an awful lot of it in an organisation like this is down to behaviour of the organisation and how do individuals use the assets we provide. What we can't do in a lot of cases is actually match the ambition of the individuals. We're all used to segregated waste at home, but as an organisation, we don't really do it very well. And that's a big area where we need to put a lot of effort into and look at those contracts we've got for waste disposal and how we can actually drive a green agenda to make West Midlands Police one of the greenest forces in the UK.
Thank you. Very welcome. Anybody? Yes, please.
Just one final question from me, Chair. Thank you. You probably touched on it, but yeah, we've been told, number one, significant funding reductions. It's a sad state of affairs where we are, police budget being reduced. We've got vehicles. We've been told that in the future we're going to have to go greener. Now we're talking about stations and buildings being greener, but obviously now vehicles being greener as well. Is that something we are looking at now, or is that something we're going to look at nearer towards the deadlines when they approach?
No, thank you for the question. I take great pride in stating that we are the first police force to have electric vehicles. Over 8 years ago, we brought in neighbourhood electric vehicles on a diary car arrangement. So if there was not a response requirement, but an appointment made to go and see a member of the public the next day, then we brought in 30 electric cars to do that function across the 10 neighbourhood units through the years of time. Those vehicles parked up overnight, so a fantastic opportunity to have recharging without vehicle downtime. The vehicle wasn't being used, that's the time to recharge it. But recharging on our own estate, because unfortunately recharging police vehicles in public charging areas could attract more criminality. So let's recharge them on our own estate. So not only did we bring in electric cars, but we also brought in electric recharging infrastructure. Now that was fit for purpose for the time, 8 years ago. What we need to do now is look at upgrading that recharging infrastructure to be fighting fit, ready for when electric vehicles become the norm, as you rightly point out. We are looking at what we could do today to switch to more electric vehicles, and it could be quite simple, looking at the operational cycle of some of those vehicles today. Some could quite easily switch to electrification, but we haven't necessarily got the charging infrastructure to the right capacity, say 22 kilowatts per hour at all the sites. So that's the sort of thing we're working on. But we are working closely with consultants as well to see what the art of the possible is on full electrification, or which vehicles we can never really consider full electrification for.
Now that's a great example, because it's also something that I'm really keen on, that we've brought the charging in-house. The other things we can look at, that we're doing outsourcing, that we can bring in-house, that can do ourselves?
So I'm not sure I understand.
Right, okay. So at the moment, we've looked at, before we used to charge vehicles elsewhere, we've now brought in electrical charging machines where we can charge our vehicles on site. For me, that's in-house. We've brought that in-house. Are there other items that we're doing as a police force, that we're spending money on outsourcing things that we can do in-house ourselves rather than outsource that?
I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer that. I think we always look at the most efficient way of doing activities. I'm sure there are some that we have outsourced, and for good reason. And when you look at the combining of firearms licensing, the Chief mentioned earlier on, with Staffordshire, that is an example of outsourcing, and you wouldn't necessarily look to bring that in-house, because the cost-effective model is to do it with staff.
Yeah, I mean, as we work through the work we've done through austerity over a number of years on the priority-based budgeting work we do, we've usually done some competition around aspects of services to look at what it will be out. We outsource very little actually as an organisation in what we do. We do have some contractual supply to services of areas, or we find partnerships which are economic to do. So a lot of the work we did around, for example, the original Accenture partnership we did, was done because we didn't have the specialist capabilities to do some of the work, so it was more economic to buy in, in particular ways. Some of our partnerships with academia, the one we have with Warwick University around crime scene examination, for example, is a really novel partnership, which is not an outsourced service. It gives us access to largely aviation standard technologies that we couldn't use, and we do that very agreeably with Warwick by funding some of the PhD students. So we try and do novel things, but in terms of a lot of the mainstream services, we have very little outsourced. Fleet is an area we've looked at in the past, isn't it, Andy? And actually we're incredibly competitive against the market, so we haven't got a lot of major activity. But there are always going to be a balance, isn't there? We for example, we do have a balance between fuel's very topical at the moment. We've got a balance between what we go to the market for on our fuel cards and what we store ourselves. We've kind of gone to the market a little bit more over the last few years than having lots ourselves, because the cost of sustaining some of that and complying with health and safety legislation is pretty demanding. Clearly, we kind of always keep an eye on these, as you can imagine. That's quite a topical debate at the moment. But we do have a process where we challenge and look at this stuff. And again, most of the contracts are the Commissioner's contracts that we outsource, not mine. So they go through the Commissioner's office.
Thank you. I just have one question around the increase in the proposed hub response model. I think the 2018 strategy had proposed a 6-hub response model. However, the proposal is now that should become an 8-hub model. Are we able to identify where the 2 additional hubs are going to be based now? Are we able to actually identify how and where the 6 has become 8?
Yeah, I mean,
in terms of particular locations.
Sure. So if I explain this, I think I need to touch on, I think it's Stetchford and Bloxwich, is it, that are the 2 that are back in the model? Yeah. Stetchford and Bloxwich are back in the model.
Right.
So the reason for this largely are that we cast a number of aspects about where we go on these areas through the lens of austerity. The force was getting smaller, and as you were well aware, a lot of the approach to the estate strategy was end up with the right estate in the right locations with the right capability, but at the same time, be cheaper to run, because we don't want an overly costly estate. Hopefully it's changing this now. We've got slightly more officers. We're going to have a slightly bigger response department, and so what we've looked at is the spread around that. It doesn't make a massive difference on deployment times, if I'm honest. It's around capacity, and so that's why those sites have been located. So it's a change to what was proposed. I think the original approach was that we wouldn't necessarily have that at Bloxwich anymore. We're going to keep it at Bloxwich, and obviously for Birmingham we probably need to increase the numbers just with more officers, etc.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think in due time we'll probably draw that agenda item to a close. I would just say that I'm broadly supportive, Chief Constable, of the principles set out in the paper, particularly the increase in the number of response hubs. I'm pleased with the work already undertaken in relation to co-location in fire stations and local authority buildings to ensure local neighbourhood teams are kept in the communities that they serve. And I want to continue to identify further opportunities for location whenever and wherever possible. The consequence of funding reductions over the last decade, savings on running costs still need to be made to protect police officer numbers, and the forces estate needs to continue to be made fit for the 21st century. Publicly accessible police stations in each borough are of course important too. I've asked the Chief Constable to set out proposals for each police building at the November board meeting, and I'll be reviewing those proposals with a view to publishing my formal response to the recommendations as soon as possible. Thank you. So, if we move then on to item 7 on the agenda, if we may, which is violence against women and girls, and we have 2 reports on this subject. The first, of course, from Assistant Chief Constable Claire Bell, and the second from Haji Chakira and Jennifer Adler. We will take the reports one after the other, and then we'll have questions and discussions after we've taken both reports to avoid duplication around discussion and questions, if that's okay. And again, I just, for the sake of form, repeat the request that, as far as possible, we keep presentations down to about 3 minutes. That's okay. Assistant Chief Constable, take it away.
Thank you, and that's just a way of introduction. Karen Dennis is here with me she's the lead on the victim code. So this paper is to complement updates that are also being given by Jennifer and Haji, as I said. So whilst the paper does cover quite an array of subjects, it does collectively offer an insight into the focus work that's ongoing to improve the service that we offer to victims of crime, the public generally, and then more specifically to those that are affected by violence, abuse and intimidation against women and girls. I'm just going to draw out a couple of points. So in relation to the Victim Code, it's a revised code that was launched in April 2021. We touched on it a little bit earlier in the meeting. And this was to ensure delivery of a good, consistent, quality service to victims and witnesses. The new code is designed to be more streamlined, simpler and stronger for victims, making it clear that the entitlements are now right. The government is also shortly going to open up its consultation victims bill, which amongst other things would look to enshrine some of those rights into statute and therefore make them legally enforceable. The force has recently undertaken a self-assessment following the launch of the revised code, and the paper highlights the work that's now underway to continue to drive the improvements required. In relation to victim satisfaction and service standards, again in conjunction with the Office of Police and Crime Commission, the force has developed citizens' charter and service standards. These are vitally important documents both internally and externally, as they set the minimum standards the public should expect, but they also importantly inform employees of the standards that are expected of them. The external launch of the charter is actually scheduled for Friday this week, but we know both internally and externally that communication of these important documents will take repetition to embed to the level that we require and desire. The SMS survey continues to be rolled out across the force, and a performance framework and guidance for line managers on how to use most effectively the rich data that we've got available is work that is in train in order that we can continue to design standards of service. And just a reference, because I know this board is particularly interested in domestic abuse, the SMS survey will be coming to victims of domestic abuse, which rolls out through the force. But in relation to domestic abuse, whilst it will take the same structures and questions, the officer in the case will determine the timing that that survey is given to the victim to make sure that it's safe. And in some cases, may not be given if that's not appropriate. So I just share that information because that will be coming later on in the year. And finally, just violence, abuse and intimidation against women and girls. As we know, this is a huge topic at the moment and one which we've been working closely with the OPCC on. National Policing has for the first time launched a national policing strategy to tackle violence, abuse and intimidation against women and girls. In my time, I've not seen police call out quite so explicitly violence against abuse and intimidation against women and girls before, but obviously followed the public's outpouring following the death of Sarah Everard, and the strategy is developed as a result of that. Build on the progress that's already been made. It's focused on areas, the national strategy and then also the Western Police strategy, that have either had very little attention to date or are needing a greater coordination. The strategy therefore does not cover the entire broad landscape. We've had many debates about the inclusion or not explicitly of domestic abuse. So Westminster Police have developed their own policing strategy to reflect the national policing laws, nuanced to the local needs, and again building on much progress that has been made regionally, locally for us so far. A key aim is to ensure that we are taking care of our policing responsibilities within the Westminster Policing strategy, to put us in a good position in order to contribute to the partnership requirement and role that we have. So whilst fog is a societal problem that requires a societal solution, Westminster Police accept that we have got a major role to play to make women and girls feel safe, feel confident to report, prevent harm and to be perpetrated.
Thank you very much, Assistant Chief Constable. Ange, would you like to present your report, please?
Yes, thanks, Commissioner. So obviously there's a lot of detail within the written report, so I'm just going to pick out a few highlights really. And just in line with what you were saying there, APC there in relation to VORG, we are looking to establish an Ending Now Violence Against Women and Girls Alliance. The view for this alliance will be that it will provide strategic leadership across the region for tackling and preventing VORG. And it will also set the strategic direction for the West Midlands. So there will be more information on this as we sort of develop that approach. But what we do envisage for it is that the alliance structure will closely align with the current regional governance over exploitation and abuse. which includes the four-board structure, namely the sexual violence and abuse, domestic abuse, modern slavery, trafficking, criminal exploitation and missing. Also in relation to BORG, we have submitted a bid into the Safer Streets Fund. The PCC, together with partners, have put in quite a comprehensive bid into that, and we are waiting for the outcome of that bid to be made available in October. Just to kind of say that there's a lot of focus within activity within that bid around preventional work, and also addressing specific cohorts around at-risk groups, namely rough teachers and sex workers. So a lot of activity within that as well. Just to touch on the Victims Code in terms of compliance, I know we're going to go into this in terms of the self-assessment a little bit later on, but I just wanted to highlight the work that we are doing with Karen Geddes and the Victims Champions in the force around amplifying the victim's voice within the Victims Code compliance. So what we really want to understand is the victim's experience of compliance the same as our perception of it? So, you know, where we might think that we're compliant if because we've given somebody contact within a timely fashion, but actually was that contact, was it trauma-informed, was it appropriate, and will it result in them actually want to remain engaged with the process? So we've established a task and finish group, a joint task and finish group. The first meeting will be held in October, and we look to kind of extend membership of that group for all criminal justice partners. At the minute, it is just currently within the four. So that's something that is ongoing. I'll touch briefly on funding. Over the last kind of 12 to 18 months since the onset of COVID, we've had a lot of funding streams made available to us in relation to victims' landscape. You'll all know about the ISBA and ISBA uplift, so we have increased our provision there from 32 to 65, which was fantastic for us. And just by the way of an update really, is that there has been a bit of an issue in relation to the training of these ISBAs and ISBAs, just because of the volumes that are being recruited nationally. This has, however, been flagged with the national training provider, Safeguards and Women's Aid, and it is something that the MOJ are dealing with nationally. We've also had a number of funding streams made available in relation to DA perpetrators. We, as an office, have been successful in securing funding for quite I think all of these funding streams actually. So initially we were successful in enhancing our regional DVPP and Drive project. They were initially extended for 6 months and then match funded by our office for an additional 6 months. So that has now come to an end, and we're working with the providers to ensure safety and mobilisation of that. Earlier this year, we were successful in bidding for a specific stalking intervention, and that is being delivered in collaboration with the force. So there's also specific funding, and I think this is one I'll probably go into a bit more detail in relation to the DA perpetrator research. So this was made available by the Home Office to sort of add to the national evidence base really around DA perpetrators and what works with this particular cohort of offenders. So we did commission Cordish Bright to carry out a research project, and what we intend to do with that now is to hold a DA research event in November where we will share findings of that, together with a number of other pieces of academic research that have also been happening sort of simultaneously, including the Trust Advisory report, Birmingham University independent analysis of the investigative pilot, and also the VRU systems mapping work, which was conducted, I think, late last year. So we look to hold that event going forward in November, where we will do the DA learning event initially in the morning, and then use the afternoon to actually consult with partners and develop an approach towards managing the DA offenders, with a view to sort of informing our commissioning for next 20 years.
Thank you very much, Harj, for your report. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Commissioner. My first question is, recommendation 9 of the Joint Domestic Violence Section Part 1 says, the Home Office should undertake an urgent review of the role of the detective constable. This should identify appropriate incentives, career progression and support for police officers and police staff investigators to encourage this career path. It should include specific recommendations to ensure there is adequate capacity and capability in every force to investigate rape cases thoroughly and effectively. Within the report, except for a small uplift in PPU and larger uplift in child abuse, largely RASO capacity appears unaffected with resources still low. Sorry, I've got some. What is being done to further tackle this issue internally?
So first of all, the complex policing teams that deal with RASO, so there's an issue, there's a difference, I guess, between the capability and the capacity. So there is less of an issue around the numbers that sit within those teams rather than their experience. And so although the uplift only really deals with the capacity, so the kind of brief details that you've got there, there's a huge amount of work going on around uplifting the capability of those staff. And that includes looking at making sure that the training, that means the provision of detective training, as well as things like there's a sexual offences training course, there is achieving best evidence courses. These are courses and training that are needed for the detectives who are dealing with RASO. In terms of the uplift, however, just because it doesn't say that there's staff being uplifted into those teams, the major crime team, one of the remits that team would have is to deal with complex and serial sexual offences. And so that team, that inevitably will be taking away some of the work that sits within the complex team. It's difficult for those teams to then get on with their caseload. So it's also about where the work would sit, and that's looking at what the best service is for victims and to be most able to be targeted with perpetrators. The nature of some of the investigations, they do differ across sexual offences, and therefore it's also a reorganisation of the work and not just around the numbers that are going to fit into what the RASO teams are. What we call.
Thank you.
About 2.12, where it talks about our approach, which is setting out the strategy. I think it's just it says the first point here, it says ensuring this is everyone's business. My question is, how are you going to ensure that it's everyone's business and make sure that that message gets out there to everybody?
This is a police strategy, so when we say everyone's business, in this context, it is, I mean, I'll move on to the public, but this specific strategy is a police strategy, and it's still as important, though, the point is that it is everybody's business within West Midlands Police to deliver on this strategy. And we say that because there has, or there can be at times, a tendency to think that this only sits within public officers that are specifically dedicated to investigating domestic abuse and sexual offences, when in fact confidence that we can build in the public's report, the response that we can provide when we get there, the interactions that all of our staff have, whether they're talking on social media or whether they're actually interacting directly with the public, can all have a bearing on how we are seen by women and girls, in particular in relation to this strategy, and whether that impacts on their confidence. So we know from survey work that we've done, from interactions with women and girls, that how we deal with the nighttime chronic, for example, will influence whether they feel confident to report if they do suffer harm or suffer sexual offence during that nighttime chronic. And so that's why when we say it's everybody's business, it's really important that it's everybody's. I think the work that we will be doing collectively as partnership with the Alliance extend that partnership responsibility to make sure that we make it clear that it is everybody's responsibility to tackle violence and abuse against women and girls. And we've seen in the media today, as the media this week again, just how strongly the public feel about that. But also, I think as I said at the beginning of my introduction, it's a crisis problem, it requires flexible response, and it needs men and boys as well as women and girls to stand up to how we feel about violence and make sure that it's really clear that we don't tolerate it at all. And as I say, police have their role to play in that, but before the message has got to come from the partnership.
So in the partnership as well, you talked about the government are going to be doing a consultation to, or it's not started, did you say? The government is going to be
There's a
doing...
consultation in relation to the victims bill,
Yeah.
that relates specifically to the victims code. In relation to violence against abuse and girls, the government have held a consultation over the summer. I think that's now closed and that's now manifested itself in the government strategy.
How is that going to be looked at and put into the strategy or in the collective?
The victims bill.
Yeah.
And
How is that going to be implemented into
Yeah.
our real life, and how is the collective that you're working with as well going to be making it visible in our lived experience, or especially the victims' lived experiences?
I mean, in relation to the victims bill that's going out for consultation.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll start that.
Hold on a minute,
with
can I
my-
just start this again? So has the consultation taken place and finished, or is it taking place now?
So the consultation that I referred to relates to the victims bill
Yeah.
and the victims code.
Yeah.
There has been consultation in relation to violence and abuse against women and girls.
Yeah.
That has closed,
Okay.
and that has led to a government strategy.
Yeah.
So there's two lots of consultations. As this paper is
Okay.
looking at, obviously, the victims code and victims bill as well as BOR. So the victims bill consultation is due to open in the autumn.
So that leads me to the question I wanted to ask now that I'm clear. How are you and your partners going to engage that consultation is reached to the wider audience, and especially the audience areas that you cover, say for the West Midlands? How are you going to partake in making sure the message gets out there?
I'll start with the police, what the police are doing actually, and then Karen will pick up and Harji. So policing will do a policing response to the victims bill, which is the norm for government consultations, and Western Police will be part of that. There is a national lead for witnesses and victims and witnesses. We will be part of that from a specific policing perspective, and then Karen will pick up how we'll engaging the consultation. It's a government consultation, it's not a police one.
Yeah, but because it's going to be impacting on your work and this serious piece of work, for me, I think everybody should be involved in making sure that consultation gets out there and the message gets out there to the wider public, in which we are all serving, and being here is a part of our service as well. Karen?
Well, starting with the victims code, obviously, once that consultation has happened, we have a linking with the MOJ via the PCC, and we then utilise the recommendations to incorporate that into the delivery plan that we formed jointly with the PCC, which then falls back into the victims forum, which I chair, which is attended not only by internal stakeholders such as neighbours policing and response policing, but also through the PCC and also partner agencies as well. So we're very joined up in how we coordinate that messaging, that we utilise and act on those recommendations. And as Marvin talked about, part of it is that repetition around ensuring that we build that into our cultural response to how we deal with victims of crime, and also mechanisms such as when we do build around connect, etc., that we look at implementing that as part of the solution as well going forward.
So does that mean that because it's a government consultation that the force isn't going to be a part of pushing it out into engage, so people engage? Because that's the question I'm really trying to get to. How are you going to be a part of making sure this consultation gets out there, as well as everybody else would be a part of it, or I would be a part of it in other things that I do? How does the force plan to engage?
When we know clearer about the dates that we will obviously have a communication strategy, and we will use our social media reach, our neighbours policing, and our various mechanisms that we have to engage with the public. We wouldn't specifically go out and do something like that necessarily, because the government will also be pushing that consultation, as well as the victims groups will respond. So there is a whole network and approaches that are taken around government consultation. But we would push that as part of our messaging out to communities and the same out to victims groups. We've got strategic boards that we've referenced here, so it will inevitably be an agenda item, but often with these things, we need to see the questions. You know, I've done lots of these consultations. You really want to see the questions first and then try to tailor the response that we take accordingly. Sometimes it can be incredibly technical and really not engaging for the public, and then occasionally they're really, really good and they're really easy to push, and I think we just have to pause until we see the questions to know what approach we're going to take.
I may not ask you again.
Yeah.
I mean, I can just add to that. I would agree. I think with the board, specific board consultation, there was one for victims and survivors, a specific consultation process that was specifically for them. And for the victims bill, you know, I envisage it will be done in much the same way as the code consultation, which it came out, and you know, we did work jointly on the code, on the victim code consultation, so we would look to do that again. Just going back to the point around, you know, it being everybody's business, just to say that we have, within the Safer Streets bid, included a region-wide campaign, actually entitled Everywhere Should Feel Safe. And so, you know, that is going to be messaging that we can push out once we know the outcome of that bid. And, you know, that again is going to be kind of going across all channels, reaching members of the public. And again, we'll be working with our partners through the Alliance. And, you know, membership on the Alliance will include, you know, criminal justice, health, I mean, it's still in developmental mode at the moment, but it will include key critical partners to make sure that we've got, you know, that holistic picture, really.
Thank you. Yes, Gopin.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just want to bring your attention to item 1, victims. And we go further down, a couple of paragraphs. A revised code was launched in force in April 2021. We've got here treated with respect, dignity, sensitivity, compassion and courtesy, and then we've got some other examples. We've got here, second from the bottom, provide service to assist victims and their family to understand. Could you just explain to me, I've come to this country, English is not my first language, how would you provide services to assist victims and their family to understand? How would you go about delivering that?
So I guess it depends on what they don't understand. You know, sometimes it might be about how they access the service. It might be just basically a language issue. So officers have got, you know, we have, I suppose we have ways that we will communicate in families. We will be careful as to who we would use to interpret if they are a victim. But also our officers have a language line that they can call, where they can have that interpretation done on there and then at an address or at a location.
But something here, obviously, have their privacy respected, because obviously sometimes we can bring in people who can speak the same language, but then we've got that community issue again, where, you know, where I'm coming from now.
Yes, and care and attention needs to be paid to that, and that's about us as also making sure that our officers are culturally aware and are aware around the nature of the work that the nature of the incident that they're going to.
Thank you. Any other questions?
HMRC found that forces across the country responded well to the COVID landscape, and were seen to reach into victims instead of reaching out to them. However, the report also suggests that this was due to a reduction in demand from other business areas, such as the nighttime economy, which allowed domestic abuse to be truly prioritised. With COVID demand and other crime demand increasing, how will that impact on the response to domestic abuse from Midlands Police?
So I think the report that you quoted was the national narrative. And I think we've always, in reference to domestic abuse for many years, has been a priority. We look at our tasking minutes, our strategic tasking minutes for the last several years. Domestic abuse has remained one of our missions or our strategic priorities. I think if you went and spoke to neighbourhood officers, they would understand they are part of arresting our domestic abuse perpetrators on a daily basis, and there are mechanisms and processes in place that we've had to change and adapt through COVID, of course, and you know, we've got new IT systems and all of those things, but actually they are well embedded into the psyche of the organisation. I think for response, we've done a lot of work actually through the pandemic and then coming out of the pandemic around our bringing parity of response in our response time to particularly domestic abuse. And domestic abuse is always going to be a challenge in terms of responding. From simple facts such as it's always in a residential, or it's generally in a residential place, and therefore, you know, takes marginally longer time to get to them. But then through to the fact that when we go to a domestic abuse, it's more likely to be an arrest made than there are other offences. There are often required 2 officers to be present if it's happening there and then. And so there are complexities of domestic abuse, which means that it's not entirely comparable. But we have done a huge amount of work, and I've actually reduced significantly the difference between our attendance time towards domestic abuse priority calls against our non-domestic abuse priority calls. And when I talk about priority calls, I talk about priority 2 calls, so they're not our priority 1 calls, where we get to domestic abuse very quickly and very well, as we do all the vast majority of our priority 1 calls. It's priority 2 where we would see that difference. But this has been the subject of a goal group. So I guess these are just examples of, to assure you that domestic abuse has definitely not and never has come off the agenda as a priority for Westminster.
As for reassurance, my core role is that within mission support, and it's a daily agenda item within that forum, so it's one of the priority agenda items that we focus on, and it's one that regularly monitors within the contact centre as well, and will be escalated if we're unable to respond.
Thank you. I have a question, if I may, relates to page 11. One of the things that I'm very keen to ensure is that Westminster Police are using all of the powers available to them in order to safeguard and protect victims, particularly of domestic abuse. So that means making sure that we're imposing bail conditions rather than simply releasing under investigation. It means making sure that we're arresting for breach of non-molestation orders. It means making sure we're making full use of domestic violence protection notices and orders, shortly to become domestic abuse protection notices and orders as a consequence of the Domestic Abuse Act, and also imposing restraining orders whenever and wherever appropriate. But I noticed on page 11 of the report, which addresses the issue of the HMIC thematic review of policing of domestic abuse. It records in the report that forces reported numerous ways to proactively support victims, and there was a recorded increase in applications for domestic violence protection orders. The move to virtual DVPO court hearings also improves efficiency. Westminster Police has recorded a notably lower number of DVPOs than our most similar forces. Is it then the case that Westminster Police is not making full use of domestic violence protection notices and orders whenever and wherever possible?
So if I first of all just clarify the part that a lot of that commentary is from the national report. So if I perhaps start with the statistics of what we've seen around the use of DVPN and DVPO. What I don't know is who we're being compared to. So the history of DVPN and DVPOs is that we're pilot forces, and we were rolled out after that set of pilot forces. Initially, we didn't really make great use of them, and so as part of the public protection redesign back in 2019, we put in place a manager and a team who were specifically focused at delivering on DVPNs and DVPOs. So Jack Webby, who is our manager, has spent a lot of time since he came into role at looking at how we improve that. Interestingly, a comment in the national report about the use of virtual hearings is not what the experience was in Westminster Police, and we have had a journey to come on in relation to the efficiency of the court processes that we've worked with the courts around. So interestingly, Jack's experience from right through the pandemic is that actually a lot of judges in our region didn't want or weren't happy to have virtual hearings. So we've seen actually that isn't an experience that we had that's reflected in the national report. In 2019 though, we have increased the number of that we've undertaken, and in fact the huge jump came when Jacqueline's team came into place. We haven't seen, in fact they did marginally increase through the pandemic as well, so we haven't seen less against our own benchmarking. I don't think that we would dispute that we can't do more. In fact, it's written into our board strategy that the broader range of protective measures is one of our priority areas to look at. And we would love to look at increasing the amount that Jack and the team can undertake. Jack's focus, given the number of staff that they've got, is those that are in custody cases, and therefore we do see fluctuations in numbers against our arrest report. That's why we can. But we have seen some positive green shoots as well, in that we have now moved, and this is something that we've wanted for many years, to have all of our hearings now take place in a single court in Birmingham. Now that is a real step forward to both maximising the staffing and resources involved. We got committed to this area because that small team were having to travel to the depths of Dudley and then over to Coventry, when actually they could now be done. So that's going to bring huge efficiency to them. And as I say, with the press work, with the Alliance, and with all the discussion that we talked about Baltic, we are going to also start to explore how we can broaden out protective measures, not just for domestic abuse victims actually, but for stalking and harassment, for the sexual harm prevention orders, in that full array of them. And that's, as I say, part of our strategy. Restraining orders and molestation orders are obviously part of that armoury as well. And there's always improvement that can be done in relation to communication between the different courts that are involved and the different agencies. But this is something that is definitely.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can I just ask how you'll be increasing the use of forced marriage protection orders and FGM protection orders?
So obviously there's opportunity for us to use those orders is much smaller than it is for domestic abuse, as you can imagine. The numbers are smaller. I'm not sure that I would be pushing for it to be as simple as increasing. I think what I would want is assurance that we are using every opportunity to use those orders in the right circumstances. And we have used those orders, and in fact, we've been one of the first ones in the country to bring prosecutions for forced marriage in particular. So we know that our staff are skilled and aware of this. There's always, and through our work with Operation Sentinel, always opportunities to improve the knowledge of our broader workforce. But once those cases are known within the public protection unit, we've got some very skilled and experienced staff who would not only understand how to deal with victims of such crimes, but also understand the process in order to put protection orders in place, but also more importantly, prosecution.
Thank you. Another question. We've seen a distinct rise in reporting of stalking offences, and also a higher attrition rate in connection with those cases. And there's around, I believe, 80 to 100 high-risk stalking incidents a month, 80% of which are domestic abuse related. Do we need, therefore, in order to be able to take full advantage of ensuring enforcement around those issues, I mean, do we need a dedicated function or team to investigate and address those issues, do you think?
So, the simple answer, I think, to a dedicated team is no, because it's the vast majority of what you're talking about is stalking and domestic abuse, and I think we get into tricky waters if we start to differentiate between crime types in that world, and we've invested over many years into domestic abuse public protection unit, one of the largest in the country and one of the most transparent, in the sense that all of our I do think that we are having to understand in more detail what is going on within that stalking and harassment statistics. And I say that because there is some complexity in the way that we now record stalking and harassment alongside of the domestic abuse offences that has changed over recent times. And so in some cases, the stalking offence and domestic abuse will be the main offence that we are investigating. Some it will be recorded as a result of the story that the victim told us, and that is because, of course, as we know, domestic abuse is not just an incident, it's an experience and often a life for some victims. Therefore, when we actually do attend, we know they've waited perhaps a long time for us to attend for the first time, and therefore we get a story of an experience, not just of one incident. Therefore, we do need to be able to understand that better, I think, because in and amongst there are reports of incidents that are not necessarily the focus of our investigation all the time. I do think it's important that we separate stalking and harassment. I think it's important that we separate non-domestic abuse stalking and harassment from domestic abuse stalking and harassment. And I definitely agree that we need to understand the nuances of those different categories better than we do, and we also need to understand what risks sit within there and how best we can have both a proportionate but effective response to manage the risks that these pose to victims. And a lot of this is
Thank you, appreciate that. Anybody else got any other questions? I just have one final question, if I might, because we do have a few minutes left before this item finishes. So, as you know, the HMIC completed its full report response in relation to violence against women recently, and I mean, you may well be aware of this particular passage that appeared in that report, and effectively it said BARG offences need to be a higher priority, both within forces and on a national scale. Ways of working should be informed by other areas of policing, including how the service responds to serious and organised crime, county lines offending, child abuse and terrorism, in terms of both prioritisation and resources. So my question is West Midlands Police committed, in the broadest possible sense, to planning to instigate, as the Inspectorate directs, an immediate shift upwards of the priority given to policing BARG, with an even clearer focus, better funding and a relentless pursuit of perpetrators?
So I think for West Midlands Police, we've made our commitment to that in our strategy, and it covers everything that's in our gift to do within that. I think for many people in this room worked within BARG for certainly not more intensely and for longer than me, myself. But a lot of the things I think that the HMIC were alluding to require a cross-government commitment, agency commitment to that. I think, of course, and as I said both in my introduction and in the strategy, we have stepped forward as an organisation and explicitly called out of violence against women and girls strategy for the first time, and have particularly stated our commitment in terms of what police need to do and contribute to that. But I think it is really important that we are only a small part of that actually, and for us to maximise what we can give requires that collective commitment to it, and that's certainly how I read that HMIC recommendation.
I think I'd come in the back of that. So I agree with Claire's points. I mean, I think my read of what the Inspectorate is saying, I think is, and I think that's the response we've taken on the strategy. Claire says it's an integrated violence against women and girls strategy. You know, it hasn't generally been put forward in that place in the 44, but it's not common nationally either. And obviously there are some things that have gone on nationally, the appointment of a national coordinator for the work in DCC Maggie Blythe, and obviously we've already been in touch to support the work. But you know, I think there is this danger, and I talked about it on violence, that on some of these complex issues and complex social issues, there are clearly important roles for the police as a law enforcement agency. But as we talked about violence before, you know, the education, the behavioural shift is far wider than policing. And if we see it simply as a police response, and I've used counter-terrorism examples now, that things like the prevent duty, there's been an absolute desire to widen the responsibility more widely, other than just security services and policing around counter-terrorism. And so I think the area we would want to do with the strategy and the broader partnership strategy is build that wider approach to these issues, because actually if we see the sole solution to this as a criminal justice issue on its own, we will absolutely not achieve the results that are required. There are, though, however, incredibly important criminal justice issues in this space. I think we would say, particularly in the conversation we had, the perpetrator orientation of this conversation, I think, is incredibly important, one that's been had, and I think is one where the force is focused. So I think the sense is right. I think the danger of that statement is purely interpreting as a lack of prioritisation by the police. It has to be a broad system response to this.
I think in view of the time, we'll probably draw that agenda item to a conclusion. I just want to say, by way of summing up, that combating violence against women and girls was a key campaign pledge and priority, and I expect it to be reflected in the police and crime plan, that there is that level of priority attached to this issue. It's been observed that there's an epidemic of violence against women. Combating violence against women is a top priority within West Midlands Police, and I fully support them in relation to that. The criminal justice system as a whole has been letting women down for far too long, and the police need to use all of the powers available to them to safeguard victims and hold perpetrators to account, and we need to ensure that victims have access to the right support at the right time. And we need to challenge and change the attitudes and behaviours of the men who perpetrate violence against women, and we need more investment, and the government should be considering introducing tougher sentencing for rape and stalking. So if we can move on to agenda item 8, please. I just want to record my thanks to Assistant Chief Constable Claire Bell for taking those questions. Thank you very much. And also to Karen as well for your attendance. Much appreciated. So just moving on to item 8 then, emergency chapter report by exception, and we have Assistant Chief Constable O'Hara present at the meeting, and also Chief Superintendent Richard North as well to present the report. I will just repeat, since you were not in the meeting earlier, we are asking people as far as possible to ensure that the presentation of their report is restricted to about 3 minutes or so in order to maximise the opportunity for discussion and questions, and obviously understanding that the people here have an opportunity to read the report in advance, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike O'Hara, temporary ACC for operations. I've got Rich North with me here as previously Chief of Staff around Operation Colonel, which is the West Midlands response to COVID. I will take the paper as read, but I will just quickly pull out some key points if you'll allow me to share. Clearly, the purpose of the report relates to the efficiency and effectiveness of the West Midlands police response, our organisational health, but also some assurance around our understanding of the crime and demand during the recovery period and our plans to respond to that. So just to pull out a few key points, I think I'm now the 5th gold for Operation Colonel over the last 18 months, and there's been a number of silvers and chief of staff. I think as a previous police commander in Coventry, my observations are that I think West Midlands' response at times of criticality is second to none. I think it's something that we're pretty good at. I think, however, the period of the last 18 months has really clearly stretched our resilience more than we've ever experienced before. So in relation to some of the background, we do continue to monitor the internal and external infection rates, vaccination levels, etc. And I'm sure you'll already be aware around the strategic coordinating group has now stopped and ceased, and the certificate around civil continues now handed over to the regional recovery coordinating group, which will move into BAU to ensure that the recovery strategy is delivered across the region over the next 6, 12 and 18 months, etc. So around crime and demand, crime levels are increasing. We've just had a discussion around domestic abuse, harassment and stalking. So clearly you'll understand those levels of crime in the region already. We have seen a busy summer demand period. Nighttime economy has clearly kicked back in. and our students are returning sort of September, October time, and it's probably fair to say that the previous year didn't really have a freshers week, so we're probably getting double freshers this year, which is something for us to be alive to. Around the enforcement of the COVID regulations, clearly you'll understand that we no longer enforce COVID breaches, so we have seen clearly a drop-off in enforcement since March, with only 200 directions to leave since the previous board paper in June. But we do have, you'll see from the paper, good granular levels of understanding regarding our enforcement around COVID. Just around our workforce and organisational health, self-isolation I think has been a challenge for us. We've had some peaks and troughs, and clearly at times the impact of the self-isolation has been significant, but we're now seeing that at relatively low levels and being controlled and managed accordingly. I would say, and I'm sure you will see from this paper and previous papers, that business continuity and control measures that were put in place across the force, I think, mitigated the impact on us internally and helped us to continue to deliver a strong quality of service externally. And then just one element to pull out around the long COVID clinics seem to have been really well received through our workforce. Again, there's some medical debate around diagnosis, etc. However, they're well received, and we do have levels of support in place, and they will fluctuate depending on diagnosis and sickness levels of our organisation. Nationally, Operation Tala is the operational name given to the national policing response to COVID. And I think the key thing just to pull out there is there are 3 levels of PPE around policing. Number 1 is minimum, number 2 standard, and number 3 is enhanced, and we currently sit in the standard level of PPE that we deploy with. A couple of key points around costs. COVID cost us 12.34 million in 2020 to 21. We did carry forward 1.5 million into this financial year, and our expected costs are anticipated to be about 1.4 to 2 million, so we're within budget in that respect. So I'm conscious I've only got a few minutes, so there is more detail in there regarding finances and legal implications, but I will take the paper as read, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Anybody have any questions arising from the report, please? Yes.
Just looking at international traveller quarantine at paragraph 26, it says between 14th February and the 26th of August, a total of 38 persons have gone to different locations within the force area. Do you have any more detail on the nature of that?
I don't personally, but I will ask my Chief of Staff if he's got any information, forgive me.
Yes, sometimes it was problematic for people to stay when they come. So when you come in from a red list country, you'd be put into a managed quarantine hotel. During the pandemic, sometimes we had to make difficult decisions when people have absconded from the hotel. What we would do, we would prioritise those cases, track them down, and they would be issued with quite extensive fines. On occasions, we had to make decisions about the viability of using force and taking them back to a more secure location, because ultimately it's a hotel emergency. We did have individual cases where, because they'd gone back to a private dwelling where they were self-isolating, actually to expose officers to that, and then the potential for them to leave the hotel again was problematic, so that they would be recorded as absconders, but that ultimately the deterrent was created by virtue of the fact that they would receive a high-level fine. And that was just a function of the government policy around red list countries. It isn't as simple as a normal offence where you would escalate through to custody and then fines and then potentially incarceration in prison, because it's about trying to manage and reduce the exposure to the wider community between new strands of the infection. It was a problematic area, but what I can say in terms of those abscondees, they would be treated as an absolute priority.
And why they would have gone?
There's all sorts of reasons. I think it's a difficult thing to stay in a hotel in isolation in their circumstances, and a challenging thing to do. Sometimes there was a dispute over whether they needed medical attention, and that was a problematic area for us. So it might be that medical professionals say, need to go to hospital, and we took them and that's always a dilemma that we have in a normal police custody that we have to manage, and it's a difficult area. And within that context, that was like that issue came up. Sometimes people were disputed whether they should be on the red list because they were disputing where they travelled from, because it's not just the direct fighting, it's the fight you may have taken in the background of that, issues of the process and the administration and the bureaucracy, all of those sort of things that kind of manifest themselves with any sort of process like that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Question here, we talked about Freshers Week, you've probably dealt with it, I'm still dealing with it. How are you dealing with international students in Freshers Week? You've got students coming from all across the world, some from red areas, some probably travelling from countries, stopping over and claiming that we've travelled from this country. How are you dealing with that? How have you dealt with that?
Sure. If I pick up the international student issue initially, and I'll ask Rich if there's anything specific around COVID, if you're happy with that. All of our local policing units are very strong around student engagement, particularly with universities. So there's a good understanding and a good granular level of understanding of the demographic breakdown of the students that are coming into our region. And we have, in many occasions with our establishments, our universities, for example, student liaison officers who understand the levels, the locations, the courses and the behaviours of students coming into and out of the region. So in the first instance, there's an awful lot of engagement that takes place. Clearly we use our engagement tool, which is WM Now, work with our freshers and do an awful lot of work around understanding the law, our communities, behaviours and that sort of work. So I would say that the majority of the work around students is picked up through our local policing functionality. They tend to understand who's coming in, what support is needed, and provide that advice and engagement at a very early stage. Clearly, you will note from the paper that we have seen increases in hate crime, and I know that particularly on the eastern side of the force, we do have quite a high proportion in Coventry University, for example, of Chinese students, and there has been some low-level hate crime that's been borne out, and we can see that across the region. But fundamentally, the students are a well-supported population within our region, and we have a good understanding of their movements and the support in place. Rich, I don't know if there's anything specific around COVID?
Not particularly. I think it's slightly less acute because the government reduced the amount of countries on the red list, and the changes to that, I think, have made that issue slightly less acute. But I mean, a student coming in would be treated differently to anyone else who came from a red or Canada. I think the issue is not less acute.
How are you dealing with it now? For me, it's more difficult. We've got thousands of people attending football stadiums, restrictions are being lifted, but yet COVID is still here. It's not gone away. Infection rates rise, we get a rise with a drop. How are you policing that? How are you? What I'm getting is you've got international students coming across the country. Maybe restrictions in that particular part of the country are totally different from restrictions here. But do you face some barriers?
Well, my view, there's nothing for us really to enforce, really. I mean, around government regulations, clearly, there's an awful lot of support around behaviours, etc. But fundamentally, we're not in a position to enforce. Rich, I don't know if there's anything you would add on that.
That's exactly right. I think the government policy, right or wrongly, is more of an emphasis on personal responsibility, common sense, and less on regulations and enforcement. So whether it's right or wrong, we don't have the power to address the issues and concerns that you have there. That's the public health parliament issue.
Thank you. Charmaine.
Point 31 where it talks about complaints and misconduct matters relating to WMP officers and staff have risen. That can be attributed to the response to the COVID pandemic, but then it says there has been no further conduct cases related to EGC. July. My question would be, what has the learning been from those complaints that come in, and were there anything that was picked up which showed possible conscious bias? Was it and some of the issues that the force faces around diversity and its relationship with the community.
I think that area relates to officers breaching the regulations themselves in the private life. I believe, I stand corrected, but I think so. You know, I think that's what it relates to. So when there were strict regulations in place, there was cases nationally. West Midlands Police did well during that period against other forces, but perhaps as officers breaching self-isolation rules or being involved in private parties or all the other stuff that we saw in the media during that period. I think that's what that is referring to, rather than misconduct through interaction with the public on duty. I think that's
So is that somewhere in there?
Not within this paper. However, I am aware that a lot of the work, understanding the demographic of the community that we've been interacting with and any enforcement particularly. So when you look at some of the data around disproportionality, that's being fed into our legitimate use of police powers governance through Matt Ward. And I know that we've seen similar levels of use of enforcement powers across our community around stop and search, use of force and COVID regulations. And those have been formally fed into the legitimate use of police powers governance. And I think the learning is broadly similar to stop and search powers and the way we interact with the community.
So where the public or somebody like myself find some of this learning, what the forces learn, is it somewhere that public can...
So we have reported on a number of the reports previously in this board. It was a standard reporting in the report of the breakdown of demographics and gender. I mean, what we saw, and Mike's right, there was some disproportionality with an overwhelming number of younger people, which you might say, well, we kind of expected that breached COVID regulations as opposed to older members of the community. But we have previously reported on it, and you know, a number of times, which we've got that data. You know, it is available to us because we have.
I think it's just more about the learning. It'd be interesting just to find out a bit more about specifically that kind of area and some of the learning. But I think now that you brought me to where it is in the context of this report, and the staff possibly breaching and all that kind of stuff. In the West Midlands, you say that we were not too bad, but the ones who did, what became of the consequences?
Again, forgive me, I feel like I'm asking Rich to answer all my questions. But Rich has lived and breathed this for many months, so Rich, have you got a view on?
I think there are very few breaches of duty. So to address it, I'll probably have to go into specific cases, which probably aren't appropriate. But I do think, it's a little bit anecdotal, but I do think during the pandemic, in terms of officers being really disciplined with duty and set up a really high standard, we have got a lot of young officers who sort of the uplift. And I think it did impact young people more than perhaps it did middle-aged or older people. They showed a lot of discipline in their private life. It's something, as the head of response, we, as an SLT, a lot of emphasis on a set of standards, both on duty and off duty, with friends and family, and with wider community. And accepting your role as a police officer, you know, a lot of people didn't agree with the private life. Same way as you are required to enforce the law on duty, I think on the whole, we did get affected.
The only addition I'll tell that, and I would, you know, agree with everything Richard said there. It was a very, very, very small number of officers and staff that breached. But if they did, then they were treated as a member of the public. So there was no you know, exceptional circumstances. It was treated on the merits of its own case, and if they were, then we have the usual, you know, proceedings through our professional standards department that those officers and staff face. But I would just like to stress it was a very, very small number.
Thank you, Bhupinder. I think I have another question.
Thank you, Commissioner. Question from me is, our officers dealt with this, so being out there in the front line, COVID, affects everybody. What have you got in place for their well-being? Officers who have suffered from COVID, who are coming back or have come back, their mental health, fears. What have you got in place for their well-being?
I would suggest that I think the wellbeing offer from the West Midlands Police is very strong, actually. So I know that nationally there's a wellbeing service referred to as Oscar Kilo, and our wellbeing offer very much is parallel to that, it's very aligned to that. But there are a few specific things just to pull out. In the first instance, we do an awful lot around self-help, so you'll see that particularly internally there's our new wellbeing portal, and officers and staff can access that and understand what support A, they may need, and B, that they can access. So there's a personal element there. There's also an awful lot of work we've done with supervisors and line managers around upskilling them. There's an awful lot of mental health support that's out there and mental health awareness. So again, there is the physical and the mental elements to the wellbeing offer within the West Midlands. And then there's the broader work around an employee assistance program, which was previously, which has just relatively recently been renewed, and we now work with a company called VivUp. And I would probably stick my neck on the line and say that the frontline troops, officers and staff have been roundly supportive and really positive around the service provided by the assistance program. And that service is provided 24/7 and provides counselling and a range of other support to our staff. So it's very strong in that respect. And clearly I did also in my introduction pull out the specific support that occupational health are providing to our officers and staff who are either infected or worried or impacted upon by COVID. Again, the long COVID clinics are a really interesting piece because there is still some debate nationally and internationally about what is long COVID, what is diagnosis, etc., and what is the support in place. But I know that our occupational health teams have put an awful lot of effort into that, and that's been really, again, well received.
Thanks for on from that. It's great having these portals. Officers can come in, police staff can come in and log on to that human-to-human contact, that way someone can generally sit down with somebody and talk about their fears, what they've gone through, their expectations. How well are you managing that?
Well, a lot of that is driven through the support that we provide our supervisors. So there's an awful lot of work that gets done around briefing, debriefing, and those conversations at the end of a tour of duty around people's well-being, what people have attended, and any support mechanisms that might be in place. But you're absolutely right. I think COVID has provided a bit of a challenge, but also has provided an opportunity around online and virtual support, which previously we didn't really have. So a lot of counselling now, privately, continues to be delivered virtually as opposed to face-to-face. But I think internally, a lot of that work for us is about how we welcome our workforce back into the workplace if they've been isolating or working remotely. But fundamentally, it's around our officers and staff looking out for each other, but our supervisors and line managers also monitoring that and briefing and debriefing.
I'm a little bit concerned that we've got a dwindling force, which is no fault of its own. We all, if we're coming to the real world, we all realise what it's like being a beat officer. You're probably going from call to call, Some officers probably miss a break, it's the nature of the beast, sadly. But having a debrief, is an officer genuinely going to spend 15, 20 minutes, half an hour speaking to his sergeant or her sergeant or inspector? For me, have you got something in place there where an officer can go to somebody and speak to them and say, look, there's this problem?
Well, as I've described, I think the support we put in for supervisors is definitely there. We also have a buddy system online, whereby you can identify somebody who you might not want to speak to there and then. And again, there's been a lot of research around, we used to refer to it as diffusing, but post-critical incidents, around how we respond to and debrief incidents like that. So we have a trim process which is in place, which is, again, it's really well regarded. It's currently been reviewed at the moment, and it's very much in line with armed forces and other blue light services around the support we offer. But again, there is something around when that conversation takes place, it needs to be right for the individual to help their, I suppose, the way they work through the issues that they're facing. And sometimes that isn't immediately. Sometimes that needs to be either off duty at another time or during the next duty. So we try and respond to the needs of our staff as and when they require it.
It's just my concerns are, I mean, I agree with everything you said there, but my concerns are policing is a very, very difficult job. It's getting more difficult, it's not getting any easier. And I think we sometimes overlook what our, you know, our boys and girls actually going through every day, day in, day out.
I really don't think we do, actually. I think that the force puts a huge amount of effort on this. So when we talk about the employee support service, officers and staff can access counselling and support 24 hours a day. We have expanded the occupational health function we've got. We're leading force around the framework, around trauma-based informed approaches. I think that we're doing a huge amount of work on financial wellbeing because of the restrictions about pay around the work. I think we need to keep improving the work around supervisors and around the skills and abilities to do that. But obviously, the paper stays around COVID, it's not around the wellbeing work. We've just had a peer review done of our approach to wellbeing. So I think we take it incredibly seriously. I think we're also just about to do a wellbeing snap survey across the force to see where our officers and staff are. The issues are very complex around it, but I think we're taking it seriously.
Just going back on that, that's great, but the survey, do we have any feedback that you can come back to us?
So we're doing a snap survey at the moment. We do an annual survey around the work. Obviously, as with all things, it's subject to what the Commissioner puts on the table. Obviously, today's a COVID paper. If we want to explore wellbeing in the work plan, we'll explore wellbeing in the work plan.
Thank you, Rupinder. I have a question in relation to fines. Right. Looking at the table at page 8 of the report, that is dealing with the outcomes of the various 10K super fines that have been imposed. And if we have a look at those, it would appear that a total of 31 super fines have been imposed during that August 2020, July 2021 period. We've got numbers there that suggest 21 of those fines has not proceeded for one reason or another. One has been reduced to £1,000. Then we have 3 successful cases, 1 pending trial and 5 pending PCD charge. Why do you think, on the face of those numbers in any event, why do you think there appears to be such a low level of success in relation to those £10,000 super fines?
The legislation was problematic, so the government established what we call RAID legislation from Criminal Justice Act of 1994, and they just tried to cut and paste that across to the pandemic situation. Now, what was missed was that part of that legislation required, this was for indoor music gatherings, they changed some of the aspects of it, but they maintained a line of legislation that was around the repetitive music caused upset or distress to local residents. A lot of the cases that we were dealt with under the legislation and issued tickets for, in the spirit of the Act, in the spirit of what the community wanted us to do and Parliament wanted us to do, which was to stop large gatherings in secret, like pubs and that kind of thing, within industrial premises, all these kinds of things that we promote on social media and see nationally. That element of the music causing distress to local residents was difficult or impossible to prove, and to some extent was overlooked both by Parliament and by the officers executing on the ground, because they were acting in the spirit of what we were trying to prevent, which was a spread of a disease through the community and not actually what the RAID legislation was originally for. So when that came under scrutiny in the court side, that was unearthed. That was just a function of legislation being pushed through rather than anything inappropriate from what we issued.
Yeah, no, understood. I get that.
I think there's a broad challenge with, quick law isn't always great law. That's not to be critical of government, because we'd all accept the situation as unprecedented, I think. There are some real, I think, challenges policing faces as a result of this legislation that's impacted quite heavily on police legitimacy, around what we were asked to do. As I've said many times, not since 1829, the formation of fields police has anybody been required to enforce legislation about who can go into somebody's house. and that's been really tricky. I also regret, I also think as matters, potentially appear before the court, people forget what the issue was we were policing, and the nature of legislation that's being placed before courts, I think, is pretty clear. And I think we will just have to take a view, I think, on these things as they go forward, whether, frankly, the kind of ethics issues around dealing with these cases, we've got the right balance, because I think people quickly forget that, I think, what this legislation was there for and what was going on at the time, as we're now all relaxing. Certainly there is a definite defect in that. I think the other issue that was there was, frankly, you can't just impose a £10,000 fine on somebody. A number of people would not have the income to address that. Quite rightly, going to plead not guilty, and of course it's very unlikely to put a £10,000 fine on somebody. So, I think this particularly was the pointy end of quick legislation that wasn't always great, but I think it actually does exist through what was a constant chopping and changing of the legislation as well. And I think that's kind of a lesson learned going forward for public health legislation if we're ever here again. But that's made without any criticism of anybody, because frankly, government and others were all in very difficult places at the time.
Yeah, no, understood. I just have one other question arising out of fines in relation to the table on page 9. So this relates to non-10K fines issued. And the table tells us that there have been 3,216 of those, of which 1,563 are not currently paid. What's the approach to handling the non-paid lower level fines at the moment? Are they going to be pursued? Or are they going to be written off? Or is there some other strategy in relation to them?
Well, I'm not fully cited on that, but I suppose just building on what the Chief Constable said is that an unusual set of circumstances in that a lot of people who issue fines were less inclined to pay them. It sounds like a strange thing to say, but actually with things like speeding or other fines, when people reflect, because the law is so established and it's broadly agreed in society that those, say, speeding or whatever is not acceptable, people tend to pay it. This is slightly unprecedented in that it was so contentious and the legislation was developed so quickly for the reasons described that it is unusual to have such a high proportion of fines not being paid. And I know colleagues in criminal justice are trying to manage that situation. The normal process for non-payment of fine would be to issuing of warrants, additional process to try and recover those costs, or even go through a pathway to higher punishment. But as Steve said, that's problematic, isn't it, given how we got to issuing those fines in the first place.
Thank you. Just one final question, I think, from Shimon.
And it's really around the PPE and how it impacted the local police teams and how they interacted with people, or they did their property search. And now that we seem to be moving into a rise of cases again, how we're going to move forward and with the training.
So can I just, I think we need to be really clear at this juncture. There is no role for policing to enforce around COVID. Protection's right, there are no legal basis for the police to be enforcing where that law's been repealed. We're very clear, and I draw back, we forget, I think, the early bit of the pandemic. If you remember, we had a period where government imposed restrictions, but the law hadn't been passed. Forces were, I think, described trying to encourage the public to follow the rules. So while we'll always encourage the public, I think, to do safe things, when we find ourselves in a position trying to encourage people to follow laws that don't exist, it's a road for problems. So you remember all the stuff like drones and walkers and all that bit. So our challenge at the moment really is that there are currently no restrictions in place. My view is, personally, whilst the government has got some ability to reduce issues, because of this stuff, we'll have to think about what the police role is very, very carefully. But my position at the moment is we have no role in any enforcement role now about rising infections.
I think my question is more about how do the police protect themselves and the public in interacting, and now that there seems to be a rise in cases,
Oh, right.
how will
Right, I
you
misunderstood.
continue to protect yourself
Yeah.
and the public watch it interact?
Right, that's a good, so that's a great question. So I suppose the bit I would say is what Mike thinks about the PPE really, more generally. One of the things I think we did incredibly well here was we never ever were short PPE. Never ever went short PPE as a force because of, one of course from the national work we did, and you recall the previous commissioner actually used West Midlands Police Commissioner's funding to largely contract on behalf of UK policing for some of these contracts, and we made sure we got them. We kind of stepped forward in the national interests, got that work in place. I think we are advising, but you'll notice as we're walking around the building, we're still applying an awful lot of health-based approaches that we do. If you see the officers and interactions, you'll see face masks. If you saw the pride footage of officers in the crowds, we're still wearing PPE. So within the restrictions of what we are, we will follow sensible health and safety advice and interactions. We've still got a lot of costs on PPE, masks and other stuff in the building. So you can be assured we're very focused on that. I guess there is always a challenge at some stage, you sometimes have to go on hands-on as a service, and so, that will be there. But I can assure you, really, we are following constantly public health guidance, and I suspect we'll be here for a long time.
Just to follow up on that, I know that from a local policing perspective, there was an awful lot of work and thought that's gone into the impact on the quality of the engagement of neighbourhood police officers and staff with the community and the impact that maybe COVID has had on that. So there is some academic research that we're partnering alongside now just to try and understand what the impact of COVID had and the PPE and the measures and the restrictions had on the quality of our engagement and interactions with the community.
Thank you. I think that is a really good point, because I think we've discussed this, haven't we, that we were talking about it in the nighttime economy before. We've got officers who are policing things they haven't seen in their entire service, 20% of force students. So some of the things we take for granted about community engagement, they just stopped for nearly 19 months. So actually, as we start to re-interview, we start to do some of the cafes and community consultation again. We just have not done that for 18 months, and our PCSOs and officers, some have never done this interaction before. So it's not just, I think, a health and safety issue, it's making sure we reinstitute those behaviours that we regard as traditional feature of policing, and do that in a COVID secure way, clearly, with the work we're doing. And that's tricky at a time where, to a large degree, we've been enforcing the public on public health legislation as well, which is kind of, personally an era I'm very grateful has ended, because it's, it was necessary, but it has not been great. It's not been great for police-public interaction.
Thank you. I just want to conclude by saying that police officers and staff have done all they can to keep us safe throughout the pandemic. Over 60 staff we've heard in this report suffering from long COVID-19 and receiving support in clinics the force has arranged. And this highlights the effects of the virus and the impact that it's had on the police too. And I'm sure the public share my huge gratitude to the police for all that they have done to keep us safe over recent times. And whilst the West Midlands Police has received part funding to make up for the losses of income due to COVID-19, the government has yet to confirm if funding will be available to police forces to make up for their ongoing losses this year. And I'm committed to continue to push for a fair funding deal for West Midlands Police. So I'd just like to thank both of you for coming this morning and presenting your report and answering our questions. It's much appreciated. Thank you very much. And that brings us to item 9 on the agenda, which is the Chief Constable update, which is an opportunity for the Chief Constable to provide us with an update on operational policing matters.
Well, Commissioner, I think we've done quite a broad range of policing issues today, so I'm probably going to not occupy a huge amount of time around it, and we'll probably just emphasise, I think, some points I made earlier, but deal with one issue I think is public confidence issue. So the first thing I wanted to draw attention to was last week Westminster Magistrate Court dismissed an appeal to extradite 3 men from the Sikh community of the West Midlands to India. I know this is a matter of significant public attention and concern in parts of the Sikh community. So it's important I set out some facts around that particular case. So in December 2020, Westminster Magistrate Court issued an extradition warrant for the arrest of 3 men following a request from the Indian government. As per the legal direction set in the warrant, the West Midlands Police were required to undertake the arrest of the men and place them before an appropriate judge as soon as possible, which the courts did. believe there's been some misunderstanding of the role of the force in this case, so it's important to be clear. West Midlands Police were not involved in issuing the warrant, nor of the subsequent legal process that follows. We understand the arrest of men caused significant concern amongst the community. We place huge importance on our relationship with all our communities and the Sikh community, and we continue to work hard to understand these concerns and remain committed to working with everybody to ensure we have safe communities. Beyond that particular issue, I'd emphasise a number of areas. The first is obviously we talked a lot about the contact handling issues today and the demands on the force at the moment. If it's, we use an expression, I think if it's not 999, go online. We would still continue to reinforce the public the use of the online services, web chat or direct reporting. Web chat is very responsive, I think, but it is a more effective way of us managing demand from the public than answering the phone. But also think about the times you phone us. A number of people may choose to report something when they've come home from work. That's when we're really busy. There are times where actually the one-on-one system is more accessible. But as we've discussed today, also think whether this is a matter for policing. We know there's been a lot of debate, for example, nationally about things like noise nuisance. An increasing amount of noise nuisance calls are coming into the force. They are actually can only be dealt with by local authorities. And so, again, I just ask the public to think hard around what they're using the service for at the moment, because every unnecessary call on the system is a genuine victim or a member of the public who is in urgent need who's been deflected from that as well. I think we talked a lot about the nighttime economy and the transitions today. So again, I just emphasise as people are coming into our towns and cities, which we want, there's a considerable amount of policing activity ongoing. But I think people do need to think, very much about the level of alcohol that they're consuming before they have their nights out. We are seeing more drunkenness and violence. We will look very hard where licensed premises are responsible around that, always in partnership to help get the nighttime economy right, because we want our economies back in place. But actually, it is an area, I think, of considerable attention at the moment. And the final issue, as always, is just a thank you around staff. I think, Commissioner, you were right, I think, to draw out the tremendous demands that COVID has placed upon officers. And you, as you will be aware, I have, and I know you've endorsed that as well, we've commended every member of the staff and force who worked from the start of the lockdown to the easing of restrictions through this month, and officers are receiving some recognition for that. It has been an incredibly demanding phase, the period, and the bit I constantly want to re-emphasise is that our role has ended in that phase, and that it's now very much returned to public health professionals, because it's not a space that policing, I think, would have wanted to be, but clearly in the national interest it's a place where policing has had to be. Areas I would cover today.
Thank you very much, Chief Constable. So, moving on to item 10 on the agenda, there are only 2 items for noting. First of which is the Strategic Policing and Crime Board Work Plan, and secondly, the Board Actions and Future Lines of Inquiry. But no further action on those as of today, which takes us neatly onto the final agenda item, which is simply the date of the next meeting, which is noted as 26th of October, Tuesday 26th of October. So this remains for me to thank everyone for their attendance.